Hello everyone, and thank you for choosing to spend your evening here with me. If you enjoy these stories, I'd truly appreciate your subscription, like, and comment. It only takes a second for you, but it means the world to me and helps make each video even better. Now, get comfortable and let's begin. Here is tonight's story. The world's first money, gold, debts, and the origins of class division. Imagine a grey afternoon in 1972 in the city of Varna on the Bulgarian Black Sea coast. At that time, it was not a place where archaeologists expected world sensations. It was an era when concrete housing blocks were rising across Eastern Europe, and bulldozers bit into the earth, preparing sites for new industrial projects. One such machine was digging a plot of land on the western outskirts of Varna, and its operator noticed something strange in the soil. Ceramic shards, bone fragments, the glint of yellow metal. At first, they saw nothing unusual in this. Workers often tossed such finds aside, considering them mere construction debris. But what the machine had uncovered was not trash. It was the threshold of a cemetery over 6,000 years older place that would later be called the Varna necropolis. And inside it lay the oldest processed gold objects ever discovered on Earth. The archaeologist called to investigate was Ivan Ivanov, then a young and determined researcher, working at the Varna Historical Museum. To understand the scale of what Ivanov and his team found, one must imagine the worldview of the early 1970s. Bulgaria was behind the Iron Curtain. Archaeology was underfunded, and the prevailing view of prehistoric Europe was modest. The spotlight of early civilizations was firmly fixed on Mesopotamia and Egypt. The thought that the shores of the Black Sea could hide something older, something unprecedented, seemed incredible. Nevertheless, that is exactly what the bulldozer revealed to the world. As Ivanov's team began excavations, they found grave after grave. Since then, more than 300 burials have been catalogued in Varna, but one of them became legendary. It is known simply as Grave No. 43. Inside lay the remains of a man, likely in his 40s, who was buried with a staggering wealth of gold, beads, scepters, jewelry, bracelets, and appliques totaling more than 1 kilogram. This was not raw metal, but carefully crafted objects, forged, polished, and skillfully cast. For context, this was almost 2,000 years before the construction of the pyramids of Giza in Egypt. It was more than 5,000 years before the invention of coins in ancient Lydia. And yet here, in Bulgaria of the 5th millennium BCE, a man was laid to rest with treasures that spoke of wealth, status, and power. This discovery was a shock to archaeology because it forced scholars to confront a question they rarely asked regarding prehistoric Europe. What did wealth mean before the appearance of money? The burial in Grave No. 43 suggests that by approximately 4,500 BCE, people on the Black Sea coast were already distinguishing themselves not only by what they produced or consumed, but by what they owned and put on display. The gold objects in Varna were not tools. They were not weapons of war. They were symbols. They were markers of identity. In a sense, they were the first visible signs of stratification, the social division of human groups into those who had and those who had not. Here we must tread carefully. Archaeology is always an interpretation, and there is a danger of projecting our own obsession with wealth back in time. It is quite possible that Varna gold was not viewed as money in any familiar sense. It could have been ritualistic. It could have been sacred. It could have been linked to cosmology. And yet the very concentration of processed metal in one grave, and its relative absence in many others, tells us something unambiguous. Not everyone in that community was equal. Some individuals stood out as special, and that marker was gold. The accidental find of 1972 quickly turned into some of the most meticulous excavations in Eastern Europe. Ivanov's team worked throughout the 1970s and 1980s, cataloguing every bead, every bone, every ceramic shard. They did so under difficult conditions. Bulgaria at that time was under communist rule, and the international scientific community was not easily accessible. Publications in Bulgarian took years to trickle into Western journals. Nevertheless, word spread, and when photographs of the finds circulated around the world, the effect was instantaneous. This was proof that complex societies existed in southeastern Europe, long before the canonical civilizations of Mesopotamia or the Nile. The Varna necropolis is not just about gold, it is the entire structure of the burials. Some graves contain rich collections, others almost nothing. In some lie male skeletons adorned with regalia, in others women or children with modest offerings, and some contain symbolic burials without human remains at all, but with carefully arranged artifacts. Collectively, this picture reveals a society that was experimenting with roles, ritual, and hierarchy. This was not an egalitarian village. It was a society where the dead carried messages about the living order. What makes all this even more remarkable is the date. Radiocarbon analysis firmly places the Varna necropolis in the 5th millennium BC, more than 6,000 years ago. At that time, most of Europe was dotted with small farming settlements. People were just beginning to master copper ores to increase agricultural surpluses, and form trade networks spanning rivers and coasts. And yet here in Varna, the level of craftsmanship and the symbolic investment in metalworking suggest a leap in the social imagination. Someone, or perhaps a few families, decided that the permanence of gold, its luster and resistance to decay, could represent power. This was the beginning of wealth as an idea. The bulldozer in 1972 may have been a mere instrument of chance, but the gold in grave No. 43 was no accident. It was a conscious, deliberate statement buried in the ground, and in that statement, we see the roots of concepts that would later dominate human history: prestige, inequality, property, and the power of symbols. Therein lies a haunting irony. The man from grave No. 43, whoever he was, did not take his wealth with him. It lay untouched for millennia until a machine pulled it back into the light. For thousands of years, the gold existed as a silent witness. Its meaning was lost, waiting for us to find it. What we see in it today may not coincide with the intentions of its creators, but the very fact that we seek this meaning is part of the continuity of humanity. We are drawn to the flicker of eternity, even if it comes from a world completely unlike our own. So how should we view Varna today? Not as the birthplace of money in the strict sense of the word, for coins and currencies were still in the distant future, but as the earliest evidence that people were beginning to treat objects as carriers of social value beyond simple utility. The gold in Varna was not sold in markets or counted in exchange, but it was put on display in death to communicate power in life. And this is perhaps the first step on the long, winding road to what we now call money. As humble scholars, we cannot claim to know every detail. We do not know the name of the man from grave No. 43. We do not know the exact rituals surrounding his burial. We do not know whether his wealth was earned, inherited, or bestowed. But we know this: the event of 1972 opened a window for us into a world where inequality had already taken root, and where the concept of wealth was already shaping society. This window reminds us that the origins of money are linked not only to trade, they are linked to identity, to status, and to the choices people make to define themselves in comparison to others. Perhaps the real haunting question is this: was grave No. 43 the beginning of something we live with today? When we look at these gold ornaments, do we see the first glint of a system that would grow into empires, banks, and the global flow of trillions every day? Or do we simply see a fleeting experiment by one community with symbols that, by chance, survived? We may never know for sure. We can only say that the Varna necropolis marks a moment in human history, when gold first became something more than metal. It became meaning, and from that meaning, the long shadow of wealth began to grow. Let us return to that ancient cemetery by the Black Sea, and this time, let us pause before the most unsettling and intriguing of its burials. Imagine you are squatting by a grave, hidden in the earth for 6,500 years. In it lies the skeleton of a man, his bones still in place, his body stretched out on his back. Around him, with deliberate care, are arranged and scattered objects that change our understanding of the origins of power. This is grave No. 43 of the Varna necropolis, and it contains more gold than all the other graves combined, more than 1 kilogram. The obvious question is simple. Why? Why was one person buried with such a staggering concentration of wealth, while others in the same cemetery went into the ground with only a handful of beads, or nothing at all? Archaeologists often hesitate to call him a king because the word king suggests a throne, a palace, and a structured state. None of this existed in southeastern Europe in the 5th millennium BCE. But he was certainly someone whose life and death were extraordinary. The objects laid out around him include gold scepters resembling maces, heavy ornaments that could not be worn in daily life, hundreds of beads and appliques, as well as copper tools, stone blades, and skillfully made ceramics. It seems every object was chosen for a specific reason, and together they speak of a role that was larger than just economic. One hypothesis, often discussed in scientific circles, is that this man was a leader not only in a material sense, but in a spiritual one as well. Some see in him a kind of high priest, a figure whose power stemmed not only from control over resources, but from control over ritual. The presence of objects resembling ceremonial staves rather than functional tools supports this view. In the grave, there are things that were unlikely used for work or combat. Instead, they could have been symbols intended to show that this man occupied a central place in the cosmology of his community, perhaps acting as a mediator between the living and the ancestors, or between people and the divine. There is another aspect. The man's skeleton testifies to a strong build. He was likely middle-aged. His bones bear traces of physical activity, but also signs that he lived longer than many in his community. Longevity itself, in a world of unstable harvests and constant risks, could have given him a special status. To live to 40 or 50 years at that time was a rarity. The combination of age with wealth and ritual power could have elevated him to something close to royalty, even before the idea of royalty appeared at all. The gold in his grave is striking not only for its quantity, but also for its variety. There are large items, such as thick bracelets and heavy pendants, but also tiny beads that would have taken many hours of labor to produce. These small objects speak of patient craftsmanship and a community willing to devote colossal effort to the production of things that had no immediate application in agriculture, animal husbandry, or survival. Gold is soft. It cannot be used to plow a field, fell a tree, or butcher meat. Its only power lies in what people believe it represents. And this belief was clearly so strong that one man was surrounded by more than 1,000 carefully crafted pieces, each glinting in the dim sunlight of the 5th millennium. When we consider the necropolis as a whole, the contrast becomes even sharper. Most of the burials in Varna are modest. Only a few graves contain a small amount of gold, often in the form of beads or jewelry. Many contain none at all. The concentration of wealth in grave No. 43 is such an extreme deviation that it is impossible to ignore. This suggests that society had already begun to stratify, dividing into levels of status that became visible in death. In other words, the Varna necropolis provides us with one of the earliest known examples of a proto-class system. Of course, we must be careful. The temptation is great to directly project modern concepts of inequality onto this ancient community, but the pattern is too consistent to ignore. Certain individuals were clearly singled out for luxurious treatment, while others were not. And this distinction was not accidental. It was systematic, a reflection of the values shared by the community. Grave No. 43 was not just the resting place of a lucky man. It was a performance, a statement carved into the soil, telling all who saw it that hierarchy exists and that some people, in symbolic terms, are worth more than others. A detail that fascinates researchers is the presence of objects that look like tools, but are made of gold. There are, for example, chisels that could never have been functional. Their softness makes them useless for any real labor. Nevertheless, Their very shape indicates the importance of the activity they represent. A golden chisel is not a tool. It is a symbol of craftsmanship elevated to a sacred status. It tells us that production itself, the act of shaping materials, had moved into a realm where it could bestow honor and perhaps even power. Looking at these symbolic tools, we are perhaps seeing the first steps toward a society where status was linked, not only to control over land or animals, but also to control over knowledge and ritual. This man, at least in death, was depicted as a keeper of secrets, a master of codes to which others had no access. It is tempting to think of him as the guardian of a system, religious, political, or economic, that his community had begun to build. The arrangement of his grave also raises questions about the theater of death. The body was laid with care, the jewelry positioned to be on display. Was this funeral a public spectacle? Did members of the community gather to witness the burial, to confirm the special role of this man? If so, the grave was not just a place of rest, but a stage. The objects were props, and the burial itself was a ritual act reinforcing the social order. In this sense, grave No. 43 is one of the earliest known theaters of power. It is important to remind ourselves of what we do not know. We have no written records. We cannot interview the craftsmen who forged the gold or the mourners who stood by the pit as the body was lowered down. We cannot say with certainty what these objects meant to them, but we can observe patterns, and these patterns speak of inequality, symbolism, and the birth of hierarchy. The broad conclusion is sobering. If such distinctions already existed in the 5th millennium BCE in Bulgaria, then the roots of social stratification go deeper than many previously thought. The Varna necropolis hints that inequality is not merely a byproduct of states and cities. It could have emerged earlier, in farming communities that were beginning to accumulate surpluses and invest in symbols that denote differences between people. Grave No. 43, in this light, is not an anomaly. It is an early chapter in the long human story, the story of the invention of classes. The haunting question remains: did this man himself strive for such a role, or was it thrust upon him by the community? Did he see himself as special, chosen, or was he elevated after death, turned into a symbol against his own intentions? Archaeology can only hint at the answers, but the very fact that we ask this question speaks of something important. Already by 4000 BCE, people thought in categories of leaders and followers, sacred and profane, high and low. The man in grave No. 43 was not a king in the later sense, but he was certainly a king before kings, a figure whose burial marks the dawn of social hierarchy in Europe. And so we return to this pit in the ground, filled with bones and sparkling ornaments. Was it the grave of a chief, a priest, a patriarch, or simply a man whom the community decided to consider different? We do not know, but we know for sure his death left a message strong enough to survive millennia. Gold as power, wealth as a symbol, inequality as a performance. From that moment on, the trajectory of human society would never be the same. The question we must leave open is simple and unsettling. If inequality began so early, was it ever actually preventable? Imagine walking through the Varna necropolis and stumbling upon a pit in the ground that shines with gold, polished copper, skillfully made beads, and symbolic ornaments, and yet contains no bones. These are not looted graves or disturbed burials where the skeleton was lost over time. They were built this way intentionally. Archaeologists call them cenotaphs, empty graves, created as if someone should rest in them who never actually lay there. In Varna, several of the richest collections of gold and artifacts come from exactly these graves, without bodies. This forces us to pause and ask, what does it mean to bury treasures without a person? What does it mean to make wealth itself the inhabitant of a grave? The Varna culture flourished roughly between 4400 and 4200 BCE. During this time, people went to great lengths to prepare both regular burials and these extraordinary empty graves. The richest cenotaphs contain gold jewelry, clay vessels, stone tools, and, in some cases, a vast number of exquisite beads. But where we would expect to see a skeleton, there is only soil, sometimes traces of red ochre mineral pigments hinting at the symbolic presence of a body that was never there are scattered on the ground. Gold in this case is not just an ornament for the deceased, it is the deceased. Or, perhaps, it is the idea of the deceased. One way to interpret this is to view the cenotaphs as memorials. These could be graves for people who died elsewhere, whose bodies could not be recovered. In a world without roads and rapid transport, death far from home meant eternal absence. By creating an empty grave, the community could honor the person symbolically, giving them the gold they would have received if their remains had been returned. But this explanation, while plausible, does not fully capture the strangeness of the Varna cenotaphs. Indeed, in some cases, the offerings are richer than those placed with actual human remains. This suggests something more than simple substitution. Another interpretation holds that these empty graves were themselves ritual acts, created not to honor a specific absent person, but to embody an idea. In such a reading, gold becomes more than personal decoration. It becomes a substitute for presence, identity, perhaps even the soul. To fill a grave with gold and leave it empty of flesh is to state that value and power are not tied only to bodies. They exist independently, shimmering and eternal. This would make the cenotaphs some of the earliest evidence that wealth was understood symbolically, as a force separate from practical life. The objects placed in these graves reinforce this sense of symbolism. Some resemble masks or faceplates made from thin sheets of gold. They would never have been worn in daily life. They are delicate, ceremonial, and in the absence of a body, they acquire a ghostly quality. A mask without a face is neither protection nor disguise. It is a declaration that the face itself can be created from metal, that identity can be forged and buried even if no human lies beneath it. Such objects suggest that the inhabitants of Varna had already begun to think of gold as a carrier of something more than just decor, perhaps as a carrier of essence. The use of red ochre adds another layer. This mineral pigment is found in prehistoric burials across Europe and beyond. It is often interpreted as a symbol of blood, life, or transformation. In the empty graves of Varna, the ochre scattered over the soil could have substituted for the body itself, coloring the earth where bones were absent. In this context, gold and ochre together could create a kind of surrogate person, a symbolic figure, consisting of color and luster, rather than flesh and blood. If this is so, then the cenotaphs represent not just wealth, but imagination, the ability to create the illusion of presence through objects. The colossal labor expended on the manufacture and burial of these objects should not be underestimated. Gold had to be collected, forged, and polished. Beads had to be drilled and strung. Copper had to be smelted and shaped. All of this required time, skill, and coordination. That such resources were devoted to graves without bodies tells us that this action was deeply meaningful to the community. It was not a wasteful display. It was a statement that has survived for millennia. When archaeologists analyze these empty graves, they see the work of an early form of abstraction. Wealth here does not serve the living directly. It is not used to buy food, tools, or protection. It does not even mark the status of a known person in death. It is buried for its own sake, as if to say, value exists even without the person who wears it. This abstraction is one of the conceptual steps on the long road to what we now call money. After all, money at its core is a system of abstraction, a way of turning labor, goods, or promises into symbols that can circulate separately from the people who create them. The Varna cenotaphs are not money in the strict sense of the word, but they may be among the first gestures in that direction. Nevertheless, we must be humble in our interpretations. The cenotaphs could mean many things. Perhaps they were dedicated to ancestors whose bodies had long since decayed, leaving only memory. Perhaps they were offerings to invisible forces, intended to ensure fertility, protection, or success. Perhaps they were an expression of collective wealth, designed to show outsiders or even themselves that this community possessed surplus resources. What we cannot do is claim certainty. Archaeology rarely gives us that. What it gives us are patterns. And in Varna, the pattern is clear. Gold was buried as if it were life itself, even when life was absent. The haunting question that follows is this: do these graves represent the beginning of a new way of thinking about wealth, as something that can exist independently, that can be moved, displayed, and buried without needing to be anchored to a specific person? If so, the inhabitants of Varna were not just creating beautiful jewelry, they were creating ideas. Ideas that would echo in various forms throughout millennia of human history. And so, we stand before a pit of shiny objects where no skeleton is visible. And we are left to wonder, was this a grave for an absent person? Or was it a grave for the very concept of wealth? It is difficult not to feel uneasy looking at the graves of Varna, where kilograms of gold were buried in the earth, while the same people faced the endless challenge of how to feed themselves. Did the decision to bury so much wealth in the ground represent a moment of strength? Or did it foreshadow a collapse? This question has divided archaeologists for decades. For some, the Varna necropolis represents a tragic mistake by a society that valued the display of wealth above survival. For others, it represents a society whose prosperity was so great that it could afford to treat gold not as a survival tool, but as a symbol, a code, even a measure of order. The Neolithic era in southeastern Europe, often called the Copper Age, spanned roughly the 5th millennium BCE. This was a time when farming villages expanded, copper smelting was established, and exchange networks stretched across the Balkans and into the steppe. The people living by the shores of the Black Sea grew grain, raised livestock, fished, and traded with neighbors. Their settlements were not isolated. They were nodes in a network of interaction. In this context, the decision to bury gold and copper objects rather than returning them to everyday life must be understood as intentional. One school of thought argues that this decision was unsustainable. The so-called decline hypothesis views the gold burials of Varna as evidence that society invested in prestige at the expense of resilience. According to this view, accumulating or burying gold meant diverting labor and skills away from food production, irrigation, or defense. When climate pressure or social upheavals arrived, the argument goes, the community lacked the resources to respond. The necropolis, with its shimmering displays, becomes a kind of monument to excessive ambition, a society that collapsed under the weight of its own inequality. Some Bulgarian scholars writing in the late 20th century described the Varna culture as decadent, suggesting it disappeared because it placed wealth above survival. Yet this is not the only perspective. Others, such as Professor Hristo Smolenov, argue almost the opposite. For him, the gold is not evidence of decline, but evidence of sophistication. The careful measurement of some Varna artifacts, in his view, reveals proportional systems that later echoed in Mesopotamian measures, and even in the dimensions of the Egyptian pyramids. For him, these objects were not waste, but repositories of knowledge, a code written in metal, a means of preserving standards of measurement and cosmic proportions. In this interpretation, burying gold was not so much vanity, as it was embedding knowledge into ritual, ensuring its survival across generations. Even without accepting Smolenov's boldest claims, there is evidence that Varna gold functioned as more than just decoration. Many items are standardized in weight and shape, as if they were intended for comparison, counting, or matching. They do not always look like jewelry for daily wear. Some seem impractical, fragile, or purely symbolic. This suggests that gold could have served as a standard, a way of measuring value, status, or perhaps even an agreement. If so, the gold in Varna may have represented an early stage in humanity's long experiment with abstract value, that which much later would become the realm of money. It is one thing to bury gold for display, and quite another to give it shapes that seem mathematically precise. In Varna, archaeologists notice that some artifacts look standardized in weight and proportions. Thin sheets of hammered gold, small plaques, and meticulously crafted ornaments often fit into ratios suggesting deliberate measurement, rather than chance. This raises a striking question. Were the people living on the western shores of the Black Sea in the 5th millennium BCE merely creators of jewelry? Or were they encoding a system of measures, a kind of early standard by which the world itself could be measured? This idea was most actively promoted by Professor Risto Smolenov, who argued that the dimensions of Varna's gold objects reveal underlying mathematical patterns. Using modern measurement techniques, he claims to have found stable ratios that correspond to what he calls cosmic, or planetary proportions. For Smolenov, these artifacts were not trivial decorations, but expressions of a hidden order, a code that carried knowledge of universal constants. He even suggests that what later became known as sacred units of measurement might have been first formulated here, long before more familiar centers of ancient civilizations arose elsewhere. However, most archaeologists maintain a cautious stance. Many prefer to see the gold as symbols of rank, prestige, or ritual without involving cosmic systems. They point out that there is always a great temptation to find patterns in numbers, once one starts looking for them. Humans are gifted with a capacity for pattern recognition that sometimes borders on excess. And yet, the consistency of certain weights and sizes among Varna's grave goods is hard to ignore. Why would so many objects conform to narrow ranges if not to signal order, regularity, or shared standards? One cannot exclude the possibility that these were measures of value, whether of metal, labor, or status. Consider the simplest fact. Gold itself is useless for survival. It is not eaten. It does not chop wood. It cannot plow a field. Its only power lies in its durability, malleability, and luster. Choosing gold as a material for burial already implies recognition of its symbolic power. Giving it standardized shapes adds another layer, suggesting a system rather than improvisation. Some plates resemble scales or ingots, as if intended for comparison by weight. Others seem created to be worn as insignias, their sizes echoing one another with subtle consistency. Such repetition is atypical for simple decoration. What, then, were the people of Varna measuring? Some argue that these objects served as early units of accountways, of stabilizing exchange in a world where trade was expanding. Copper was being smelted, salt was supplied from inland mines, obsidian and flint were brought from distant sources. In such a context, the presence of a standard weight or unit of comparison would be valuable. Perhaps the gold plates were not money in our sense, but reference points, counters by which other goods could be measured. Thus, gold could have been a silent partner in exchange, not circulating itself, but underpinning the very idea of equivalence. Smolenov goes further, suggesting that the proportions of Varna's artifacts resonate with larger cosmic patterns. He sees in them echoes of planetary movement, astronomical cycles, and mathematical constants. According to his interpretation, gold was not only a tool for trade or status, but also a bridge between human society and the universe. In his works, he goes so far as to claim that the sacred measure, later used in monumental architecture, originates on the shores of the Black Sea, being encoded in these early treasures. Whether one finds this convincing depends on how one balances imagination and evidence. The truth is that archaeology rarely allows us to gain certainty in matters of intent. A standardized plate might have been intended for weighing grain, or it might have been created as a reflection of cosmological beliefs. A series of numerical ratios might represent cosmic order, or it might be a coincidence arising from craftsmen working within practical constraints. What matters is that Varna's material is rich enough to support both interpretations. It invites us to consider that people in the 5th millennium BC were already operating with abstract ideas of order, equivalence, and value. What makes this so striking is the depth of time. Varna predates the first known written records by millennia. It appeared before the well-documented states of Mesopotamia and Egypt, And yet here we find people experimenting with gold, not only as decoration, but perhaps as a measure, perhaps as a code. If so, the history of systematized value is pushed back thousands of years. Even if Smolanov's cosmic reading is set aside, the very act of standardizing objects implies a desire for order that goes beyond the immediate. It implies a willingness to bind society through abstract principles, rather than just personal decorations. To speak modestly, we cannot claim with certainty that a gold standard was invented in Varna in the sense we recognize later. The evidence is too fragmentary, the context too distant. But we can say that something extraordinary was happening here. Gold was not given random shapes. It was worked with care, weighed, balanced, and replicated. This repetition, this standardization is the seed of the very idea of measurement, whether it was intended for grain, social rank, or the cosmos itself. It points to a people who sought order beyond the daily struggle for survival. And so we are left with a haunting question. Did the people of Varna silently invent the world's first standard of value? A kind of proto-gold standard, millennia before history gave us coins and weights? Or, in our search for origins, are we attributing too much meaning to patterns that meant something entirely different to them? We cannot be certain. We can only say that Varna's gold, forged into precise shapes, represents one of the earliest known attempts to make value tangible, measurable, and durable, and that alone is a revelation worth reflecting upon. Long before the first pharaoh placed a crown above the Nile, and long before stones were moved to form the first pyramids, communities on the shores of the Black Sea were already experimenting with metals, symbols of power, and social hierarchies that would later define the face of civilizations elsewhere. The Varna necropolis on the Bulgarian coast dates to approximately the middle of the 5th millennium BCE. It is centuries older than the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, and even older than the emergence of the first monumental cities in Mesopotamia. This raises a question that is both tantalizing and difficult. Could the societal models observed in Varna have influenced or prefigured those later civilizations? Or were these separate experiments in the general human search for order and meaning? Archaeology has shown that the Balkans and the lower Danube basin were not isolated at that time. The copper-rich Carpathian Mountains supplied raw materials to networks that stretched into the steppe, across Anatolia, and toward the eastern Mediterranean. Salt from mines in present-day Romania, and gold from riverbeds in the Bulgarian highlands, moved through systems of exchange that were both regional and long-distance. Although writing had not yet appeared, the circulation of objects tells its own story. Small figurines, polished stone axes, and ornaments made their way through different cultures, testifying to a level of contact that should not be underestimated. When we compare this with Egypt of the same period, we find societies on parallel but not identical trajectories. In the centuries preceding 3000 BCE, communities along the Nile were also organizing into more stratified forms, recognizable by cemeteries where some individuals were buried with rich goods, while others were not. Elite tombs in places such as Hierakonpolis contain objects made of copper, ivory, and exotic materials, not unlike the contrast between rich and poor graves in Varna. However, the Egyptian trajectory led to centralized royal power and monumental architecture. While the Balkan Danubian cultures eventually declined, their settlements' tells were abandoned, and metallurgical traditions faded. In Mesopotamia, the Uruk period also unfolded in the 4th millennium BCE, marked by the growth of large urban centers, monumental temples, and the first known writing systems. There, too, wealth differentiation is visible in both architecture and burials. But where the Sumerians left texts and massive structures of mud brick, the people of Varna left a silent field of graves, their voices preserved only in the gold and copper they took with them into the earth. The question is not whether there was direct contact, which is difficult to prove, but whether these parallel experiments were driven by similar forces: surplus production, control over resources, long-distance trade. and the human tendency to codify differences. Theories of influence between these regions have long attracted scholars. Some argue that metallurgical knowledge visible in southeastern Europe spread to Anatolia, and then to the Near East, providing the foundation for later Bronze Age traditions. Others caution against such linear models, emphasizing that several regions could have discovered similar techniques independently, having access to ore and fire. Balkan cultures show some of the earliest evidence of copper smelting, predating the large-scale bronze industries of Mesopotamia. But whether this knowledge traveled is a question we cannot yet answer. What is more certain is that ideas of prestige and power tied to rare materials arose simultaneously in several parts of the world. In Egypt, gold would later become the quintessential symbol of divine power, associated with the flesh of the gods. In Mesopotamia, temples accumulated precious metals as offerings to deities, storing them as both wealth and sacred property. In Varna, long before these traditions crystallized, gold was already a marker of distinction, encircling bodies and buried in empty cenotaphs. This parallel does not prove contact, but it reminds us that human beings across vast distances often converged on similar symbolic uses of the same materials. The geography should also be noted. The Black Sea region lies at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, between the steppe and the Mediterranean. Rivers such as the Danube served as natural corridors for movement, and the coast opened paths to Anatolia. In subsequent millennia, these paths would become channels for Indo-European migrations, Greek colonization, and countless episodes of contact. It is reasonable to assume that even in the 5th and 4th millennia BCE, people, objects, and ideas moved along these same routes. If so, the cultural experiments in Varna did not remain hidden, but may have been noticed by neighbors, who carried these stories further. An intriguing comparison lies in the treatment of the dead. In Varna, rich graves with gold and copper tools suggest not only social rank, but perhaps ritual roles, chiefs, or priestly figures. In pre-dynastic Egypt, the emergence of elite cemeteries also signaled the growing importance of leadership. The difference is that in Egypt, these roles evolved into formal royal power, while in southeastern Europe, the system faltered. This contrast invites reflection. Why did one region arrive at sustained statehood, while the other faded into obscurity? Was it an environmental factor, where the Nile provided unsurpassed agricultural stability? Geopolitical, where the Nile Valley was easier to defend and control than the open plains of the Balkans? Or was it simply historical accident, the unpredictable path of human choice? Another dimension is the question of symbolism. Regarding Varna, some scholars suggest that gold may have carried meanings beyond status, perhaps encoding measures or cosmological ideas. In Egypt, cosmology would be tightly woven into political power, where rulers were represented as mediators between heaven and earth. If Varna gold did indeed embody notions of order, then it stands as a predecessor to the blending of cosmology and power that later became explicit in pharaonic ideology. Again, we must be careful not to draw hasty conclusions, but this resonance is difficult to ignore. What does all this mean for our understanding of early civilization? At the very least, Varna demonstrates that the roots of social stratification, symbolic wealth, and organized burials go deeper and spread wider than the traditional centers of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Civilization did not emerge in one place, spreading outward like light from a lamp. Instead, many regions experimented with complex social forms, some of which flourished, while others withered. Placing Varna alongside pre-dynastic Egypt and Uruk is to see a mosaic of human creativity, rather than linear progress. And so we are left with a haunting possibility. Could the people who buried their dead with gold by the Black Sea have whispered something into the deep currents of human history, their practices echoing faintly in the rise of later civilizations? Or was it a brilliant but isolated experiment, a flash of complexity that burned brightly and then faded, leaving others to carry the torch further? We cannot know for certain. We can only say that before the pharaohs and before the pyramids, There were already kings without thrones and standards without empires, quietly shaping the possibilities of what humanity could become. When did people first decide that some lives were worth more than others? This is a question that does not lead to one specific place or moment, but the graves in Varna, on the western coast of the Black Sea, offer some of the clearest early evidence. In the 5th millennium BCE, a community decided to bury one man with more than a kilogram of gold, while others were placed in the same cemetery with few things or none at all. This choice alone suggests that wealth and power were not distributed equally. But inequality is not just about gold objects. It is a model of how societies are organized. And during this period, the Neolithic layers of archaeology across southeastern Europe point to a gradual, but undeniable increase in differentiation between people. The graves of Varna are striking in their contrast, but they are not alone. In Dankalak, another burial site on the Bulgarian coast, hundreds of burials revealed differences in grave goods, suggesting that some people had greater access to ornaments and tools than others. Further north, the Cucuteni Tripolia culture built enormous settlements in the forest steppe of modern Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine, with some communities numbering tens of thousands of inhabitants. Within these settlements, houses varied in size and content, hinting that status differences existed even within densely built neighborhoods. What unites these examples is that people began to sort themselves into social categories, and these categories were recognized in death just as they were in life. Why did this happen in the 5th millennium BCE? One explanation lies in the changing nature of labor. Agriculture, which had spread to Europe millennia earlier, had reached a level of intensity where surpluses could be created. These surpluses allowed certain individuals to specialize in activities beyond simple survival. Some became full-time craftsmen, creating ceramics, weaving textiles, or shaping ornaments. Others worked with the new and dangerous technology of metallurgy, smelting copper from ore and casting it into tools or prestige objects. These specialists needed support from the entire community, which meant some households or individuals produced enough food not only for themselves, but for others as well. Once this division of labor took root, it created space for differentiated power. Those who controlled the surpluses could also control the relationships. Metallurgy in particular deserves attention. The ability to extract copper and gold from the earth required both knowledge and access. Ores were located in specific regions, such as the Balkans and the Carpathians, which meant communities situated near these sources could possess influence. The people who mastered the smelting and forging of metals were few, and their skills could be kept secret. This exclusivity reinforced inequality, as ownership of metal tools or ornaments set certain individuals apart. In Varna, the appearance of copper axes and chisels in rich graves suggests not only practical utility, but also symbolic weight. They could be signs of power, as much as working tools. To possess a tool that no one else could make was to signal a special place in society. Craft specialization also extended beyond metals. The Cucuteni Tripolia settlements are famous for their intricately painted ceramics, produced on a scale that suggests the presence of dedicated master craftsmen. Some researchers believe that pottery production was centralized, with specific workshops supplying entire communities. If so, these artisans occupied privileged roles, supported by the redistribution of food and materials. The architecture of these settlements also hints at hierarchy. Some houses were larger, with more complex hearths or storage areas, while others were smaller and simpler. These differences are subtle compared to later palaces and temples, but for their time, they marked a nascent spectrum of wealth and status. Burial practices offer one of the clearest windows into inequality, because they record the community's decisions about who deserved what in death. In Varna, the richest burials contained not only gold and copper, but also finely crafted flint blades, ornaments made of exotic stones, and imported shells. The poorest contained only the body itself, sometimes with a modest ceramic vessel. This sharp contrast suggests that some individuals were considered far more important than others, and this importance was recognized by the society as a whole. Whether this reflected lifelong power, ritual authority, or family status is a matter of debate. But the message of inequality is unambiguous. It is worth noting that inequality does not necessarily imply the presence of kings or formal rulers. In the 5th millennium BCE, these societies were still relatively small, lacking the scale of cities in later civilizations. Inequality in Varna, or Cucutini Tripolia, might have taken the form of lineage heads, ritual leaders, or wealthy households rather than monarchs. Nevertheless, even without crowns and thrones, these early elites possessed real influence. They could command labor for their burial rites, accumulate ornaments, and pass wealth down through generations. In this sense, they were the first to step onto the path that would eventually lead to the kings, empires, and stratified worlds known to us from later history. How did ordinary people react to this growing inequality? It is difficult to say for certain. Archaeology shows us the results: who was buried with gold, and who was not. But it does not record dissent or acceptance. Perhaps communities viewed these differences as natural, linked to ritual or spiritual roles that gave meaning to the group. It is equally possible that inequality bred tension, and some families resented the power of others. In the large settlements of Cucutini Tripolia, where thousands of people lived in close quarters, managing differences must have been a constant challenge, whether through cooperation or conflict. These early experiments in hierarchy set the stage for the more formalized stratification that would follow in later millennia. An important element in this story is that inequality was not uniform across all regions. In some parts of Europe, burials remained relatively egalitarian with few grave goods, even in wealthier communities. In others, such as the Balkans, the contrasts were extreme. This suggests that inequality was not an inevitable outcome of farming or metallurgy, but a social choice. Different communities experimented with different ways of organizing themselves. Some leaned toward communal distribution, others toward the concentration of power. Varna, with its glittering graves, represents one of the most striking examples of the latter choice. The haunting question is whether inequality strengthened or weakened these societies. Did elites help coordinate labor, trade, and rituals, making communities more resilient? Or did they siphon off resources, burdening the majority and leaving societies vulnerable to collapse? Varna itself declined by the end of the 5th millennium BCE, its cemetery falling silent and its traditions fading. The mega-settlements of Cucutini Tripolia were also eventually abandoned. Perhaps inequality contributed to their fragility, or perhaps it was climate, migration, or mere chance. As humble researchers of the past, we must admit that we do not know. What we can say is that by the 5th millennium BCE, humanity had crossed an invisible threshold. No longer were all members of a community treated equally in life or in death. Some were elevated, adorned with gold and copper, while others were left with nothing. This was the first inequality, fragile but real, a model that would echo through countless generations. And we are left to ask, if a society once decides that some lives are worth more than others, can it ever truly go back? If you lived in a world without coins, markets, or banks, how would you pay your debts? The answer is that you probably never thought of it in those terms, at least not as we do now. Long before coins, contracts, and ledgers, people exchanged things in networks of trust, memory, and obligation. In the Upper Paleolithic, spanning the period from roughly 40,000 to 10,000 years ago, people were already navigating complex social landscapes bound by shared hunts, gifts, and mutual aid. In such worlds, what we might call money did not yet exist, but the roots of money were already forming in something more basic: the memory of who owed what, and the social expectation that debts would one day be repaid. Anthropologists, such as Chaparuka Kazimba, emphasize that debt is older than money and that gift exchange lies at the heart of human cooperation. In small hunter-gatherer groups, sharing was not optional, but necessary. A large animal killed could not be stored for long, so it was distributed among the group, A hunter did not become wealthy by hoarding. Instead, he acquired prestige through generosity. Others remembered his contribution, and later, when roles were reversed, they reciprocated. This was not barter in the sense of trading a spearhead for a hide on the spot. It was an economy of memory, where social ties were reinforced by repeated acts of giving and receiving. The idea of reciprocity defined everything. Gifts were rarely free. They carried an invisible obligation. The anthropologist Marcel Mauss famously called this the spirit of the gift, a sense that giving creates a bond requiring a return. Among hunter-gatherers and early farmers, this spirit ensured cooperation in an uncertain environment. If you shared meat today, you could count on others sharing with you tomorrow. Debt in this sense was not recorded on paper or stone, but was etched into the minds of the community members. Forgetting to return a debt could mean a loss of trust, and in small groups where survival depended on cooperation, that could be a disaster. As human groups became more sedentary during the Neolithic period, starting about 10,000 years ago, forms of exchange became more complex. Farming communities produced surpluses of grain, livestock, or craft goods, and these too circulated through networks of gifts and obligations. Archaeologists find evidence of exotic materials moving over long distances during this period. Obsidian blades from Anatolia appearing in the Levant, or seashells from the Mediterranean found far inland. Such exchanges likely occurred not through impersonal markets, but through reciprocal relationships. One community might gift obsidian blades to another, expecting livestock, textiles, or future support in return. These were the foundations of trade routes, but the logic was still rooted in reciprocity, not profit. What made this system work was memory. People remembered who was generous and who was stingy. Oral traditions and reputations served as ledgers long before writing. This social accounting was often reinforced by ritual. Ceremonies, feasts, or marriages could formalize obligations, with witnesses ensuring that debts were recognized. A feast, for example, might be organized by a family that had slaughtered many animals to feed the entire community. In return, that family acquired prestige and the expectation that others would support them in difficult times. The feast itself was not just a meal. It was a statement of wealth and the creation of debt. We see the persistence of this system in practices that survived into historical times. Tally sticks, used in medieval Europe, were simple pieces of wood with notches to record debts. They may look primitive compared to coins or registers, but they reflect the same principle, a shared recognition of an obligation that can be recalled and settled later. In the Neolithic, there may not have been sticks or registers, but the principle was the same. The community itself was the account book. Each member held the knowledge of what was owed, and gossip or collective memory provided accountability. Anthropological studies of modern traditional societies provide analogies that help us imagine this ancient economy. Among the Trobriand islanders, the cooler ring involved the exchange of shell valuables over vast distances. These objects circulated endlessly not because they were useful in themselves, but because they created relationships. To receive a cooler shell meant accepting an obligation to pass it on, to host guests, to make a return gift. Wealth lay not in possession, but in participation. Similar models are observed among pastoralists, where the exchange of livestock seals alliances, or in the potlatch ceremonies of the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, where chiefs demonstrated status by giving away vast amounts of goods, separated by time and space. These examples show a deep human tendency to create systems of wealth based on reciprocity. Returning to the Upper Paleolithic and Neolithic, one can imagine that what looked like simple sharing was actually the framework of economic life. A flint tool passed from one group to another, a shell necklace given to a bride, or a portion of grain gifted to a neighbor during a bad harvest. All of these carried obligations. To us, they may look like small acts of generosity, but for those who lived them, they were threads in the web of social survival. If money is fundamentally a way of tracking obligations, then these networks were the earliest forms of accounting. It is important to emphasize what this was not. It was not barter in the classical sense, the exchange of a pig directly for a bushel of wheat. The idea that early economies were purely barter-based is largely a myth popularized by modern economics but not supported by ethnography. Instead, people relied on long-term relationships where debts and credits flowed through time. The immediacy of barter was too fragile for real societies. What mattered was the flexibility of gift economies, where value lay not only in the thing being exchanged, but also in the connection created. The haunting question is what it is like to live in such a world, knowing that your obligations are remembered rather than recorded, and that your reputation is your credit, sharing meat and hoping that tomorrow others will remember your hunger, giving a daughter in marriage and believing that her new family will one day support yours. These are not bank ledgers, but they are the ledgers of humanity's deep past. And herein lies a paradox. Before money had a name, before coins or credits, the logic of debt was already shaping us. Our species survived because we trusted others to remember what was owed and to act accordingly. These invisible bonds were the first economy, as fragile as memory, but as durable as culture itself. We may never know exactly how Paleolithic hunters calculated their debts, or how Neolithic farmers balanced their exchanges, but we can say with some certainty that money did not appear out of nowhere. It grew from the gift, from reciprocity, from the unspoken obligation. When someone gives to you, you will one day give in return. And perhaps the most haunting question of all is whether we have ever truly left that world. Why did shells, such small and seemingly fragile objects, become more valuable than food in many parts of the ancient world? To us today, this idea may sound strange. After all, you cannot eat a shell. You cannot build a shelter from it. And yet, for thousands of years, people in Africa, Asia, and Oceania valued shells above almost everything else. They were worn, traded, buried, and eventually recognized as one of the world's first global currencies. The mystery is not why shells were beautiful. They are, of course, beautiful, but why they acquired such persistent symbolic and economic power. So much so that they outlasted empires, crossed oceans, and left traces in the earliest economies we can reconstruct. The story begins deep in prehistory. Archaeological evidence indicates that as far back as 9,000 years ago, shells were being used in ways that hint at a proto-currency. Cowrie shells, in particular small and glossy with a characteristic slit-like opening, appear again and again. They were gathered from the sea and transported far inland, proving that people valued them enough to carry them over vast distances. Unlike food or tools, shells served no immediate practical needs. They did not spoil. They were easy to transport, and their rarity provided a kind of built-in scarcity. In a sense, they already possessed the qualities that later societies would value in money: durability, portability, and the perception of a limited supply. By the time of Neolithic farming societies, shells were circulating not just as ornaments, but as objects of social and economic weight. Archaeologists have found shell beads and necklaces buried with the dead, sometimes in places where such shells could not have been collected locally. This suggests they were traded or gifted through networks spanning long distances. The act of burying shells with the deceased also signals that they were more than decoration. They held symbolic value, perhaps marking status, wealth, or spiritual protection. Shells were already acting as concepts larger than themselves. The dominance of cowries is especially striking. Their smooth, polished surface and small size made them ideal for handling, counting, and stringing. In many ways, they functioned as the first standardized tokens. Strung into long strands, they could be transported in bulk. Counted individually, they could serve as small units of value. In Africa and Asia, cowries became the objects through which debts, marriages, and even punishments were negotiated. This was not barter, where grain was exchanged for cloth. It was something closer to a unit of account, a proto-money that simplified transactions between communities that shared no common goods or resources. In China, Cowrie shells feature prominently in archaeological sites of the Neolithic and early dynastic periods. They were used in rituals, buried in tombs, and later even imitated in bronze to serve as money-like objects. When the shells themselves were in short supply, the Chinese word for money retains a linguistic echo of this deep history. The character for currency originally included a depiction of a cowrie shell. This is a remarkable testament to how deeply shells were imprinted on the human imagination as symbols of value. In Africa, the use of shells as currency lasted for millennia. In some regions, it persisted well into the historical era. Cowries were imported in vast quantities along trade routes, particularly through Indian Ocean trade networks. They became central to West African markets, where they circulated alongside other forms of wealth such as iron tools, textiles, and livestock. At their peak, they served as the dominant currency in parts of Africa, regulating exchanges ranging from small purchases to major political deals. Shells were counted by the tens, hundreds, and even thousands, much like coins or bills today. For many, they represented the very idea of money. The symbolic power of shells extended beyond economic exchange. In Oceania, shells were woven into complex systems of ritual and prestige. The cooler ring and exchange system among the Trobriand islanders involved the circulation of shell valuables over vast distances. These shells were neither consumed nor kept permanently. Instead, they were passed on, creating relationships of obligation and alliance. Each transfer strengthened the bonds between groups and individuals. Shells were the medium through which trust and status circulated, functioning not just as currency, but as markers of the social fabric. What made shells so resilient as a medium of value was their dual nature. They were simultaneously natural and symbolic. They came from the sea, evoking associations with mystery and the far-off. Yet they could be counted and standardized. They were portable and durable, yet they glistened in a way that appealed to the human senses. Their beauty made them desirable, their rarity made them scarce, and their portability made them practical. Unlike grain, which could rot, or livestock, which could die, shells endured. They could travel across deserts, up rivers, through mountains, and still retain their value upon arrival. Some scholars suggest that the use of shells as money tells us something fundamental about how humans think about value. It is not utility alone that determines significance. Value is often created through shared belief, through a collective recognition that a certain thing matters. A shell could not feed a village, but if the village agreed that shells represented obligations or wealth, they became indispensable. This collective fiction, if we wish to call it that, is the same logic that underpins modern currencies. A banknote itself is just paper, but its power comes from a shared agreement. In this sense, shells represent the first great experiment in the shared imagination of value. There is a darker side to this story as well. In later centuries, shells were imported into Africa by the millions as part of transoceanic trade, including the slave trade. Cowries became entwined in systems of exploitation, demonstrating how something once valued as a symbol of reciprocity and community could become a weapon within global commerce. While this lies far beyond the Neolithic roots of shell money, it shows how durable the logic of shells was, capable of adapting to different scales of exchange and different moral worlds. If we return to the earliest evidence of shells in burials and exchanges, one haunting question arises. Did people see them as wealth or as symbols of something deeper? Were they tokens of beauty, amulets against misfortune, or literal units of account? The truth is that they were likely all of these at once. For some, they may have represented spiritual protection. For others, prestige. For still others, a way to measure obligations. What we can say for certain is that shells allowed humans to move beyond direct exchange and create systems of value that travel through time and space. Ultimately, shells remind us that money was never a matter of utility alone. It was a matter of trust, beauty, rarity, and shared belief. Long before coins were minted or ledgers inscribed, Long before markets became global in the modern sense, shells were already connecting communities, binding people together with invisible debts and shaping ideas of what it means to be wealthy, powerful, or respected. There is no single answer to the riddle of why shells meant more than food. But perhaps that is the point. Food satisfies hunger for a day. But a shell satisfied something deeper. The human need to create meaning, to establish order, and to recognize value in that which endures. And perhaps the most humble thought is that, in a way, we are all still doing the same thing today, just with different tokens. Would you buy bread for a cow? At first glance, the question seems absurd, but in the deep past of human economies, such an exchange was not only imaginable but entirely reasonable. Long before coins, banknotes, or electronic transfers, wealth was measured in things that lived, things that could be consumed, and things that could be carried. Livestock, salt, obsidian, copper ingots, all of these became forms of what anthropologists call commodity money. They were practical, tangible, and valuable in their own right. But they also had serious limitations. And it was these limitations that pushed human societies toward imagining systems that would one day become more standardized. The story begins with animals. Domesticated livestock was one of the first forms of wealth that could move between households and communities. Cows, goats, and sheep were not just sources of food. They reproduced, gave milk, pulled plows, and provided hides for clothing. They embodied wealth in a way that grain or stone could not. A cow was a renewable resource, a walking store of value. In early Neolithic societies, especially around 9,000 years ago, cattle became a central measure of status and exchange. Giving someone a cow meant providing them with long-term security. Receiving livestock as a bride price or tribute meant increasing one's status. In many Indo-European languages, the words for money and cattle share the same root, reminding us that the connection between animals and wealth was not symbolic, but literal. Nevertheless, there is an obvious problem here. You cannot divide a cow into smaller parts without destroying its value as a living creature. A sheep may be worth less than a cow, but even then, livestock is not divisible in the way a transaction might require. If you wanted to pay a neighbor for a small service or a bag of grain, offering an entire animal would be excessive. Animals also die, fall ill, or run away, making them an unreliable means of storing value over time. For all its importance, livestock lacked the flexibility necessary for an exchange system that could move beyond households or ritualized agreements. This is where other commodities entered the story. Salt, for example, became one of the most widely valued commodities in prehistoric and ancient economies, essential for preserving food and sustaining life. Salt possessed both practical utility and symbolic weight. Communities that controlled salt sources could command trade routes and exert influence over their neighbors. Salt blocks or carefully measured portions were exchanged as units of value. The durability and divisibility of salt made it much more convenient than livestock for daily exchange. To pay someone in salt meant providing a resource that could be stored, consumed, or put back into exchange. The word salary in later languages would preserve this memory, though the practice itself is rooted deep in times preceding recorded history. Other materials played a similar role in different regions. Obsidian, a volcanic glass valued for its sharpness and beauty, was an object of trade over vast distances as early as 9,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence shows that obsidian tools and blades moved from their regions of origin in Anatolia, the Caucasus, and East Africa to communities hundreds of kilometers away. To possess obsidian meant having both practical cutting power and a rare commodity, something that marked status and facilitated exchange. Unlike livestock, obsidian could be broken into smaller pieces and distributed, but its value depended on its rarity. When sources became commonly accessible or new deposits were discovered, its function as proto-money faded. Copper ingots open another chapter. In the 5th and 4th millennia BCE, as metallurgy spread across parts of Europe and the Near East. Copper was shaped not only into tools, but also into standardized forms. In some regions, large copper ingots in the shape of an ox-hide flat, heavy slabs resembling stretched animal skins became recognizable stores of value. Their shape allowed them to be stacked, transported, and measured. They carried an abstract quality closer to what we later came to call currency. But here, too, there was a problem. They were extremely heavy, impractical for small transactions, and required a massive infrastructure of mining and smelting. Only societies with sufficient organization could maintain their circulation, which limited their reach. Would you buy bread for a cow? At first glance, the question seems absurd, but in the deep past of human economies, such an exchange was not only imaginable but entirely reasonable. Long before coins, banknotes, or electronic transfers, wealth was measured in things that lived, things that could be consumed, and things that could be carried. Livestock, salt, obsidian, copper ingots, all of these became forms of what anthropologists call commodity money. They were practical, tangible, and valuable in their own right. But they also had serious limitations. And it was these limitations that pushed human societies toward imagining systems that would one day become more standardized. The story begins with animals. Domesticated livestock was one of the first forms of wealth that could move between households and communities. Cows, goats, and sheep were not just sources of food. They reproduced, gave milk, pulled plows, and provided hides for clothing. They embodied wealth in a way that grain or stone could not. A cow was a renewable resource, a walking store of value. In early Neolithic societies, especially around 9,000 years ago, cattle became a central measure of status and exchange. Giving someone a cow meant providing them with long-term security. Receiving livestock as a bride price or tribute meant increasing one's status. In many Indo-European languages, the words for money and cattle share the same root, reminding us that the connection between animals and wealth was not symbolic, but literal. Nevertheless, there is an obvious problem here. You cannot divide a cow into smaller parts without destroying its value as a living creature. A sheep may be worth less than a cow, but even then, livestock is not divisible in the way a transaction might require. If you wanted to pay a neighbor for a small service or a bag of grain, offering an entire animal would be excessive. Animals also die, fall ill, or run away, making them an unreliable means of storing value over time. For all its importance, livestock lacked the flexibility necessary for an exchange system that could move beyond households or ritualized agreements. This is where other commodities entered the story. Salt, for example, became one of the most widely valued commodities in prehistoric and ancient economies, essential for preserving food and sustaining life. Salt possessed both practical utility and symbolic weight. Communities that controlled salt sources could command trade routes and exert influence over their neighbors. Salt blocks or carefully measured portions were exchanged as units of value. The durability and divisibility of salt made it much more convenient than livestock for daily exchange. To pay someone in salt meant providing a resource that could be stored, consumed, or put back into exchange. The word salary in later languages would preserve this memory, though the practice itself is rooted deep in times preceding recorded history. Other materials played a similar role in different regions. Obsidian, a volcanic glass valued for its sharpness and beauty, was an object of trade over vast distances as early as 9,000 years ago. Archaeological evidence shows that obsidian tools and blades moved from their regions of origin in Anatolia, the Caucasus, and East Africa to communities hundreds of kilometers away. To possess obsidian meant having both practical cutting power and a rare commodity, something that marked status and facilitated exchange. Unlike livestock, obsidian could be broken into smaller pieces and distributed, but its value depended on its rarity. When sources became commonly accessible or new deposits were discovered, its function as proto-money faded. Copper ingots open another chapter. In the 5th and 4th millennia BCE, As metallurgy spread across parts of Europe and the Near East, copper was shaped not only into tools, but also into standardized forms. In some regions, large copper ingots in the shape of an ox-hide flat, heavy slabs resembling stretched animal skins became recognizable stores of value. Their shape allowed them to be stacked, transported, and measured. They carried an abstract quality closer to what we later came to call currency. But here, too, there was a problem. They were extremely heavy, impractical for small transactions, and required a massive infrastructure of mining and smelting. Only societies with sufficient organization could maintain their circulation, which limited their reach. Why was the first currency not a coin you could hold in your hands, but a weight of silver you often never even saw? The history of money in Mesopotamia begins not with glistening discs, stamped with the heads of rulers, but with accounts, obligations, and promises recorded on clay. About 5,000 years ago, in the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, people began measuring debt in units that became known as shekels. The shekel was originally not a coin, but a unit of weight, approximately 8.3 grams of silver used to calculate indebtedness. And this distinction is important because it tells us that the oldest money served not for market exchange, but for recording relationships of credit and obligation. Context is crucial here. Mesopotamia of the 3rd millennium BCE was a world of city-states rising among irrigated fields, each clustered around temples that dominated not only religion, but also the economy. These temples controlled vast agricultural lands, herds, workshops, and labor. They stored grain, distributed rations, and managed trade. In essence, they were the first institutions large enough to require complex accounting systems. Clay tablets preserved from that era are filled not with epic poetry or royal decrees, but with lists, barley deliveries, beer distributions, quantities of wool, worker obligations. In such a system, money was not primarily a medium of exchange in daily life. It was a unit of account, a way to standardize the value of various goods and services. Silver became the point of reference not because everyone used it directly, but because it provided a stable unit in which obligations could be measured. A worker's wage, a tenant's rent, a merchant's debt, all of this could be expressed in silver shekels, regardless of whether silver actually changed hands. Archaeologists studying cuneiform tablets have found thousands of references to shekels, many of which clearly describe debts or obligations to be repaid in goods rather than metal. A laborer might be owed a fraction of a shekel for work, paid not in silver, but in barley, beer, or oil. The shekel created a common denominator, a way of comparison and accounting. This suggests that money, at least in its early Mesopotamian form, was not born from barter. The old story that people first swapped cows for grain until they realized they needed coins does not align with what the tablets show. On the contrary, people first built systems of credit and debt and only later materialized them in the objects we now call money. The shekel was an abstraction before it ever became a coin. The role of the temple in this process cannot be overstated. Acting as a central authority, temples provided trust and continuity. They issued rations to workers, recorded loans to farmers, and acted as intermediaries in trade. When a farmer borrowed seed grain, the debt was calculated in shekels with the understanding that repayment could be made in kind. During the harvest, when merchants engaged in long-distance trade, their contracts fixed the value in shekels. Even if the goods themselves were exchanged directly, the shekel anchored these systems in a language of weight and value that could be carried between communities. But tension also existed. Silver had to be acquired, usually through trade with regions where mines were located, and this made it scarce within Mesopotamia itself. As a result, the shekel's role as a unit of account was far broader than its role as a medium of exchange. Many people likely lived their entire lives without ever holding actual silver in their hands. Nevertheless, debts and obligations in silver defined their economic reality. The shekel functioned as invisible money, existing primarily in records and expectations. The ration system clearly illustrates this. Workers hired by temples or palaces often received payment not in silver, but in daily or monthly rations of barley, beer, and oil. However, these rations were calculated in shekel equivalents. In other words, the shekel told administrators how much labor was worth, how much food should be issued, and how obligations added up. Here, money was not about market purchases, but about keeping the vast mechanism of the temple economy running. We also see in these systems the beginnings of interest-structured debt that goes beyond simple barter or reciprocity. Some tablets record loans with a specified return exceeding the principal amount, suggesting that even in the 3rd millennium BCE, people understood that a loan of silver or grain created an expectation of profit. This practice could bind families to long-term obligations, shaping social relationships as much as economic ones. Debt was not just a practical reality, but a moral and political force. The shekel as a unit of measurement made this possible by standardizing what might otherwise have been incommensurable. Another layer is revealed when we consider weight. The shekel was part of a larger system of weights and measures. 60 shekels made 1 mina, and 60 minas made 1 talent. This sexagesimal structure, based on multiples of 60, reflected the mathematical innovations of Mesopotamia. To define a debt in shekels meant tying it to a broader system of measurement governing time, space, and value. A day could be divided into hours, a field into measures, and wealth into shekels, all within a single mathematical logic. Money here was not just practical, it was conceptual, part of a worldview that sought order through numbers. It humbles us to realize how little this resembles our modern ideas of money. There were no coins passing from hand to hand, no pockets filled with ringing currency. Instead, there were clay tablets with cuneiform signs, silent witnesses to obligations that could last months or years. The shekel was an idea before it was an object, a measure before it was a medium. It reminds us that the origins of money lie not in exchange, but in trust, in record keeping, and in the human drive to make obligations durable over time. Of course, there is much we do not know. Did ordinary households calculate value in shekels when trading among themselves? Or was this language limited to temples and elites? How widely did actual silver circulate in markets? And how often were debts actually paid in metal rather than goods? Evidence suggests that daily exchange continued to rely on barter and commodity trade, while the shekel governed the larger networks of institutions. But the boundary between these spheres must have been blurred, and people developed their own local practices. The haunting question is this: if the first currency was not a coin, but a unit of debt, what does that say about the very nature of money? Was money from the very beginning less about freedom of exchange and more about control, less about opportunity and more about obligation? When a farmer in summer signed a clay tablet acknowledging a debt in shekels, he entered a system that tied him to the temple, to the ruler, to the creditor. The shekel gave a language to these bonds, but it also gave them permanence. In this sense, the silver currency of Mesopotamia was not just an economic tool, it was the beginning of a system that would define human life for millennia, an endless balancing of accounts, the weight not just of silver, but of debt. Has gold always been only for the rich? Or did it begin as something else, an object of beauty, a sacred material, a trade commodity that later hardened into the symbol of wealth as we know it today? To answer this question, we must move between the different lands of the ancient world, where silver, grain, livestock, and shells all vied for the right to serve as a measure of value. In Mesopotamia, silver anchored the language of debt, but along the Nile, it was gold that shone brightest, not only in temples and tombs, but also in trade caravans and diplomatic gifts. Between the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, gold began to acquire weight beyond ornamentation. It became one of the first materials that could travel long distances and retain its value across different cultures, although the role of metals in the Nile Valley was far from what we call money today. This region had its own peculiar relationship with them. Unlike Mesopotamia, where obligations were defined by silver, Egypt in the early dynastic period had no silver deposits of its own. Gold, however, was abundant. From the deserts east of the Nile to the mines of Nubia, Egyptian rulers could command flows of the yellow metal. Archaeological research in the eastern desert has uncovered remains of ancient mining camps, grindstones for crushing ore, and even traces of smelting operations dating back to the early dynasties and the 3rd millennium BCE. For Egypt, gold was not only accessible but plentiful, and plenty gave it power. Pharaohs hoarded it, temples accepted it, and craftsmen turned it into diadems, bowls, and masks. But was this gold money in our sense? Evidence suggests not, at least not at first. In the Old Kingdom of Egypt, beginning around 2700 BCE, gold was inextricably linked to the divine and the royal. According to Egyptian beliefs, it was the flesh of the gods, eternal and incorruptible. This made it the ideal material for funerary objects intended to preserve the essence of the ruler. In the afterlife, the Great Mask of Tutankhamun, crafted more than a millennium later in the 14th century BCE, still reflects this same symbolic role. Gold as eternity, as divine permanence. Here, gold served not for exchange in markets, but to assert status and cosmic order. At the same time, Egypt was never isolated, and its gold entered deep economic networks. By the Middle Kingdom period, and even more noticeably in the New Kingdom, gold became a key material in diplomacy and trade. Records from the Amarna archive 14th century BCE describe how Egyptian pharaohs sent gold as diplomatic gifts to Near Eastern kings. Other rulers pleaded with Egypt to send more gold, noting its abundance almost with jealousy. For the kings of Babylon or Mitanni, receiving gold from Egypt meant recognition of their status. For Egypt, sending gold meant demonstrating superiority. Thus, gold became a medium of power across borders, functioning not as a coin, but as a currency of prestige. The scarcity of silver within Egypt also reinforced this contrast. In Mesopotamia, silver was the standard of accounting, but in the Nile Valley, it was rare. Silver imports came through trade, often from the Levant or Anatolia. As a result, Egyptian valuation systems tended to use copper or grain for accounting within their own administration, while gold remained the supreme metal of prestige. In essence, gold in Egypt and silver in Mesopotamia played complementary roles. Each was a standard in its region, but they meant very different things. Silver was practical, tied to debts and rations, while gold was symbolic, linked to eternity and royal power. This does not mean that gold never circulated in more economic contexts. Gold rings and ingots have been found with traces of use as units of value. Some texts suggest that gold by weight may have been part of exchanges, especially in international trade. Caravans coming from Nubia or ships arriving from Punt carried gold that could be used in negotiations for exchange for incense, exotic animals, or other luxury items. Gold in this sense acted as a store of value easily transported, recognizable, and rare enough outside Egypt to be in high demand. But it can hardly be called money in a structured sense, because it did not have the standardized role that silver played in Mesopotamia. If we shift our gaze to Anatolia, the Aegean region, and beyond, we see a similar complexity. The 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE witnessed the expansion of metallurgical trade networks. The shaft graves at Mycenae c. 16th century BCE are full of gold masks, jewelry, and cups. These were clearly symbols of elite status rather than common exchange. In the Indus Valley, gold jewelry also appears, again linked to rituals and elite display. Across all regions, gold consistently marks hierarchy and sacredness more often than market utility. Thus, the shift during the period between 3000 and 1500 BC was not that gold suddenly became a coin, but that it began to circulate as an interregional medium of valuation. For the Egyptians, it was divine. For their neighbors, it was treasure. And in the spaces between these meanings, gold acquired a peculiar universality. It could bridge cultures without being standardized, much like cowrie shells did in later centuries. This universality allowed it to become a kind of early world currency of the elites, moving through palaces and courts rather than bazaars and stalls. It is striking how much this contrasts with modern ideas about money. Today, we think of money as the great equalizer, a thing that everyone uses daily. But in antiquity, gold was the opposite. The more sacred and restricted it was, the more power it carried. A farming peasant in the Old Kingdom of Egypt was far more likely to count grain, copper, or workdays than he was to ever touch gold. For him, it was distant, locked away in temples and tombs, visible only during ceremonies. And yet, the fact that he did not hold it in his hands could only strengthen its power. The rarity of gold in daily life made it the ideal tool for rulers, who embodied something beyond the ordinary. It is also worth considering whether the very incorruptibility of gold made it the ideal candidate for the role of money in the long term. Silver tarnishes, copper corrodes, but gold remains unchanged. This timeless quality likely reinforced its role as a store of value. When rulers sent each other golden gifts, they were sending not only wealth, but also permanence. A gold bracelet will not rot, it was a fragment of eternity. In this sense, gold already contained within it the seeds of its future as money, even though it was not formulated in such terms at the time. And yet a haunting question remains. Was gold ever truly money in those early centuries, or was it something more ambiguous? By calling it money, we risk projecting onto the past a concept that had not yet crystallized. Instead, we see gold as a material that could mean many things at once. The sacred flesh of the gods, a sign of royal power, a tool of diplomacy, a medium of exchange in rare instances. It had not yet become the everyday language of value, but it was already becoming the universal language of power. Perhaps the better question is not when gold became money, but why people across all cultures consistently gave it such weight. Was it because of its brilliance, durability, rarity, or the fact that it seemed to defy decay in a world where everything else rotted? The Egyptians saw eternity in it. The Mesopotamians measured obligations in silver, but still craved Egyptian gold. The Mycenaeans buried their leaders in it, over 1,000 years. From the 3rd to the 2nd millennium BCE, gold occupied its niche not because of its utility in trade, but because of its indispensability in meaning. And perhaps that is exactly what made it ready to eventually become money. Not its practicality, but its symbolism. For if money is ultimately about trust and belief, then the long history of gold as a sacred and eternal material may explain why, millennia later, it still glimmers in our imagination as the standard by which value itself is judged. Who was the first to begin minting metal, turning it into money? And why did this moment have such profound significance? 4 millennia before this, people weighed silver, traded shells, counted livestock, and hoarded gold ornaments. Value was stored in objects. But these objects had to be weighed, checked, and tested every time. They carried the burden of trust with every exchange. Then, somewhere in the 7th century BCE, in a small kingdom on the western edge of Anatolia, something new appeared. Pieces of metal marked with symbols of power, guaranteed by the state, accepted at face value and not just by weight. These were the first coins, and they appeared in Lydia. Lydia was a land both lucky and restless, located between the Aegean coast and the Anatolian plateau. It possessed rivers in which electrum flowed, a natural alloy of gold and silver. The Pactolus River, in particular, carried deposits of this pale shining substance. Unlike pure gold or silver, electrum was inconsistent. The ratio of gold to silver in it varied, making its value unstable when traded by weight alone. To solve this problem, Lydian rulers began issuing standard pieces of electrum stamped with an image. This image was a guarantee. It told the holder that the piece had a recognized weight, and was backed by the authority of the king. Thus, a material that was inherently uncertain became reliable through political trust. The appearance of the earliest of these coins is usually dated to the reign of King Alyattes. in the early 6th century BCE. These were small, bean-shaped lumps of electrum with simple marks punched into the surface. Later, under King Croesus, Lydia refined this system. Croesus, who ruled in the middle of the 6th century BCE, is credited with creating coins of pure gold and pure silver, separating the alloy into distinct standards. This was a decisive step, as it made the value of each coin transparent. A gold crocide was gold, a silver one was silver, and both were accepted in an ever-expanding circle of trade. These innovations did not stay only in Lydia. Ionian Greek cities along the coast, including Miletus and Ephesus, quickly adopted the minting of coins. Proximity to Lydia and constant interaction in trade made coins attractive. For merchants accustomed to haggling over the weight of metal or bartering goods directly, coins offered a portable, recognizable, and efficient medium. A stamped piece of metal could pass from hand to hand quickly without lengthy verification. In bustling market centers, in ports where goods arrived from all over the Mediterranean, this speed mattered. The image stamped on these early coins carried a meaning that went beyond confirming weight. These were symbols of identity and power. The Lydians used lions, the emblem of their dynasty. The Greeks who followed them struck owls, turtles, or city symbols on their coins. A coin was not only a piece of metal, but also a statement. It linked a transaction to a community, a ruler, a shared trust. In a sense, every coin was a political message as much as an economic tool. One might wonder, why did the minting of coins originate in Lydia, and not in the great civilizations further east, where wealth and trade had flourished for centuries? Part of the answer lies in geography. Lydia was at the crossroads between the Near Eastern kingdoms and the Greek world. It was close enough to inherit the complex accounting traditions of Mesopotamia and Egypt, but also close to the dynamic trade networks of the Aegean. It was small enough to experiment, flexible enough to innovate, and rich enough in electrum to support these attempts. The effect was revolutionary. For the first time, money became not only a store of value and a medium of exchange, but also a symbol recognizable at a glance. The difficulties with weighing and assaying diminished. Trust shifted from the hands of individual merchants to the authority of the stamp. This was a shift in psychology as much as in economics. By accepting a coin, a person trusted not the one standing across from them, but the authority that issued it. This created a new type of bond between subjects and rulers, tying the economy to political power more tightly than ever before. The legend of King Croesus vividly captured this moment. Croesus was remembered as a fabulously wealthy man, so wealthy that his name became a household word. To be rich as Croesus meant possessing limitless wealth. Behind this legend was a real innovation. His coins circulated far beyond Lydia, influencing the practices of the entire Mediterranean. The Persians, who conquered Lydia in the middle of the 6th century BCE, adopted and adapted the minting of coins for themselves. Greek city-states refined it further, creating distinctive civic coinages that became the calling cards of their identity. The spark ignited in Lydia spread quickly, reshaping both economics and politics. But did everyone adopt coins equally? Evidence suggests that, while elites and merchants found them useful, many ordinary transactions still relied on barter, weighed silver, or goods. A farmer might still pay in grain, a shepherd in sheep. Coins did not replace old forms of value overnight. Instead, they added a new layer, particularly suited for long-distance trade, taxation, and payments requiring standardization. The history of coins is not a story of sudden revolution, but a story of gradual layering. The coin existed side by side with other systems, slowly growing in significance until it became dominant. One might also ask, did coins democratize money or strengthen the control of rulers? In the case of Lydia, the latter seems more likely. By issuing stamped metal, the king controlled the standard. He could change the weight, recall old issues, and introduce new ones. Minting allowed rulers to imprint their authority on every transaction, turning the market into a space where political power was felt daily. In this sense, coins were not only a practical tool, but an instrument of centralization. Archaeological finds confirm the reach of Lydian coinage. Hoards of early electrum coins have been discovered in Asia Minor and Greece, sometimes buried, sometimes lost in temples or houses. These coins often bear the simple punch marks of early issues, testimony to their experimental beginnings. As designs became more complex, their role as both economic and cultural objects expanded. Coins became a canvas for art, as well as a guarantee of value. And yet the haunting question remains, why at this particular moment, and in this place, did people decide to turn metal into money through minting? Was it a necessity born from the complexities of trade? Was it abundance, since the electrum of Lydia provided raw material in extraordinary quantities? Or was it a more subtle shift, the realization that trust could be standardized through symbols? We may never fully know. What we do know for certain is that with the Lydian coin, money took a form that would dominate for much of subsequent history. It became something that could be held, carried, and instantly recognized as shared language of value that knew no borders. Thus, in the valleys of western Anatolia around 600 BCE, the world's first coins were minted. They were small, irregular lumps of electrum with images of lions, but they carried an idea so powerful that it would ripple through the millennia. From Lydia, the experiment spread to Greece, Persia, and beyond, taking root in economies and imaginations. And we are left to wonder, when those first coins clinked in a merchant's hand, did he know he was holding not just metal, but the beginning of an entirely new way of thinking about trust, value, and power? However, by the 5th century BCE, something had changed. Coinage, once a useful tool for merchants, transformed into the circulatory system of armies and the pulse of empires. Silver and bronze ceased to represent commerce alone. They became instruments of war and politics, and their presence determined the rise or fall of entire states. This story is most clearly seen in the example of Athens. At the beginning of the 5th century BCE, the Athenians made a discovery that transformed their city and, in many ways, the entire Greek world. In the Laurian region, a rugged stretch of land southeast of Athens, lay rich deposits of silver ore. Developing these veins was no simple task. It required tunnels, workers, furnaces, and a state ready to invest in infrastructure. But the reward was immense. From these mines flowed the silver that filled the Athenian monetary system. The famous tetradrachs featured the head of Athena on one side and an owl, her symbol, on the other. These coins, durable and recognizable, became a trusted currency throughout the Mediterranean. They were so stable in weight and purity that merchants accepted them far beyond Athens, and soldiers carried them on distant campaigns. But the true revolution was not just economic. Thanks to this flow of silver, Athens gained the means to pay rowers, hoplites, and, eventually, thousands of citizens who manned a vast navy. War ceased to be the duty of those who could afford to leave their farms for a season. It became a profession sustained by state payments. In the course of this shift, coinage became both a political and military force. When the Persian Wars broke out in the early 5th century BCE, Athens was still a rising power. The decision to build a vast fleet of triremes was largely made possible by the silver from Laurian. Each trireme required 200 men for rowing, and these men could not work without pay. Silver made their service possible. The mysticals, the Athenian statesmen often credited with steering Athens toward naval supremacy, saw the mines as a gift from the gods. Instead of distributing the wealth directly among the citizens, he insisted on using it to build ships. This decision helped Athens not only repel the Persian onslaught, but also transform into a maritime empire. The consequences were colossal. With a paid navy, Athens could project power far beyond its borders. Control of the seas allowed them to dominate trade routes and bind other Greek city-states. Into the Delian League, the coalition was formed against Persia, but quickly turned into an Athenian empire in all but name. Tribute collected from allies often returned in the form of silver coin. Reinforcing this cycle, soldiers and sailors fought for wages, and their wages kept the empire afloat. Money and power became inseparable. At the same time, the use of coins changed politics at home. Democracy in Athens flourished in part because silver allowed citizens of modest means to participate in public life. Jurors were paid for their service, as were officials and participants in the popular assemblies. The city could maintain a broad base of political participation because silver, redistributed through salaries and stipends, supported citizens who otherwise could not afford to leave their work. Thus, coinage and democracy became intertwined, reinforcing one another. But the gift of silver was a double-edged sword. Paying soldiers created dependency, and dependency created vulnerability. As long as silver was abundant, it was possible to maintain armies and fleets, coerce allies, and defeat enemies. But when revenues fell, the entire system shuddered. For example, in the later stages of the Peloponnesian War, Sparta received Persian subsidies that allowed it to build a fleet and hire rowers, nullifying the Athenian advantage. The struggle was no longer just about courage or tactics. It was about who could most consistently supply the coin. Victory depended not only on the prowess of soldiers, but on the minting of silver discs, with images of gods and owls. Other Greek city-states followed a similar path. Corinth, Aegina, and others issued their own coins with distinctive designs. These coins circulated widely, but the principle remained the same. Minting allowed states to maintain professional armies and navies, turning war from a civic duty into a paid service. Mercenaries became increasingly common men who fought not for a homeland, but for whoever offered the best pay. This marked a profound shift in the nature of Greek warfare. Loyalty was no longer tied only to the polis. It was tied to the coin. Archaeological evidence of coin hoards from this period illustrates the scale of monetization. Soldiers and sailors carried their pay with them, sometimes burying it for safety or losing it on campaigns. The uniformity of Athenian owls made them especially sought after in international markets, and their presence far from Attica demonstrates how far the influence of Athenian coinage extended. The mines of Laurion, dark and exhausting, echoed in the ring of minting presses and the clashes of naval battles. However, as much as coinage gave Athens power, it also sowed the seeds of instability. Reliance on paid service meant that if the pay stopped, loyalty could falter, mercenaries could desert or even turn against their employers. Cities that could not maintain regular minting risked collapse. Thus, silver was simultaneously the glue and the solvent, binding empires together, but also threatening to dissolve them if the flow dried up. Looking back, we see how radical this shift was. Before the appearance of coins, war was seasonal, tied to the agricultural cycle, fought by people who returned to their farms after it ended. With coins, war became continuous, professional, and large-scale. Empires could expand far beyond what a subsistence economy allowed. Political systems, such as Athenian democracy, could expand participation through payments, but at the cost of tying freedom to the mines and the mint. This gives rise to a haunting question. When the Athenians cheered the launch of their shining triremes, when they struck the owl of Athena onto new silver discs, did they know they were tying their democracy, their empire, and their very survival to the extraction of metal deep underground? Did they feel that honor was being weighed ounce by ounce against silver? We may never know. We only know that in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, the Greeks taught the world a lesson. Armies and empires marched not only on courage or grain, but on coins. And from that moment on, no state desiring power could ignore the call of money. How do you manage an empire with the loose change in your pocket? At first glance, coins might seem too small and mundane to carry the weight of an empire as vast and turbulent as Rome. And yet, the Roman world, stretching from the windswept borders of Britain to the deserts of Syria, was held together not only by legions and roads, but by the clinking of coins exchanged in markets, barracks, and temples. The Roman coin was more than just currency. It was a language, a tool of propaganda, a contract of trust between the state and the people. Every denarius, Every sesterces carried messages from emperors who might never set foot in the distant provinces where these coins circulated. They were the pocket messengers of the empire. The history of Roman coinage begins in the 3rd century BCE, when Rome was still just establishing its dominance in Italy. Previously, the Romans used bronze ingots and bars cumbersome and inconvenient for daily trade. As Rome grew and clashed with Carthage in the Punic Wars, the need for more practical, portable money became acute. And the beginning of the 3rd century BCE, Rome introduced the denarius, a small silver coin that would become the backbone of its economy for centuries. The denarius weighed about 4.5 grams, and the stability of its weight and purity made it universally trusted. Alongside it appeared bronze and copper coins for small-scale exchange, and gold coins for major transactions. By the 2nd century BCE, the denarius was everywhere. Soldiers were paid in denarii, and merchants in distant provinces could rely on the value of this coin. Rome's expansion and Roman money went hand in hand. As the legions advanced, so did the mint. In newly conquered lands, local coins were sometimes tolerated, but Roman ones increasingly dominated, replacing older systems. The empire could not impose its will everywhere by the force of garrisons alone, but coins could penetrate markets, homes, and temples, binding distant communities into the Roman economic order. Coins also became a mirror of Roman politics. On their sides, emperors projected power, lineage, and divine favor. Julius Caesar, in the mid-1st century BCE, was the first Roman to place his own portrait on coins during his lifetime. This was not just a gesture. Until then, coins had depicted gods, personifications, and symbolic motifs. By stamping his face, Caesar was asserting a kind of semi-divine authority, challenging republican tradition. After his assassination, his image and the title Divine Julius continued to appear on coins, cementing the link between minting and imperial propaganda. Augustus, Rome's first emperor, brought this art to perfection. His coins showcased not only his face but also messages of peace, fertility, military victories, and continuity with Rome's divine ancestors. The denarius became a portable billboard of the new order. Throughout the empire, peasants and soldiers might never meet Augustus, but they carried his face in their purses. Later emperors followed this example, each carefully crafting their coinage to project strength, piety, or legitimacy. In periods of crisis, coins were one of the first places where emperors sought to assert their power. A rebel or usurper might mint coins to claim their authority, and if these coins circulated widely, the claim gained weight. Coins also carried news of Rome's achievements. Victories were celebrated with coins depicting conquered peoples, captured weapons, or triumphant generals. Religious festivals, building projects, or even grain supplies were commemorated in metal. For the average Roman, a coin was not only a tool of exchange, but also a window into the broader world of the empire. Coins connected ordinary people to events and rulers far beyond their village or city. But the strength of this system rested on trust, and trust depended on the stability of the metal content. For several centuries, the denarius maintained a relatively stable silver content. However, as the empire began to strain under the burden of military expenditures and political upheaval, the debasement of the coinage began. Debasement is the process of reducing the precious metal content in a coin, while maintaining its nominal value. A denarius that once contained almost pure silver might later contain only half, then less than a quarter, with the rest consisting of alloys with cheaper metals. This process accelerated in the 3rd century San era, that historians often call the crisis of the 3rd century. Rome faced invasions, civil wars, plague, and economic collapse. Emperors, desperately in need of funds to pay soldiers and the administration, increasingly resorted to debased coinage. Coins became lighter, their silver content dropped, and eventually, many became nothing more than bronze discs covered with a thin layer of silver. Trust collapsed. Merchants demanded higher prices, Soldiers mutinied when their wages lost value. Inflation skyrocketed. The cycle of coinage debasement reveals the fragile balance between minting and empire. When coins were trusted, they bound the empire together. When trust disappeared, cracks appeared everywhere. Some emperors attempted to carry out reforms. Diocletian, at the end of the 3rd centuries, tried to stabilize the currency and even issued an edict on maximum prices to curb inflation. Constantine, in the early 4th century, introduced the solidus, a new gold coin of remarkable stability. The solidus restored faith in coinage and lasted for centuries. Long after the fall of the Western Empire, the Roman mint was concerned with more than just economics. It was also about control. By issuing coins, the state could regulate the medium of exchange. The mints themselves were symbols of imperial power, often located in key cities throughout the empire. Control over the mint was control over the message, over the source of life, over the means to maintain armies. During civil wars, rival emperors fought for the loyalty of the mints as fiercely as for the legions. Because minting proclaimed legitimacy, archaeological finds of coin hoards testify to both trust and fear. People buried coins during times of crisis, hoping to retrieve them later. Thousands of hoards have been found for which no one ever returned, perhaps because their owners perished or were unable to go back. These buried caches give us a map of anxieties, showing where war or instability forced people to hide their savings. They also remind us that coins were more than just state propaganda. They were a lifeline for ordinary people trying to protect their families in troubled times. The Roman monetary system also reflected hierarchy. Gold aurae, and later solidi, were used by the elite in large transactions and in the imperial treasury. Silver denarii, and later antoniniani, circulated widely among soldiers and merchants. Bronze and copper coins served the daily exchanges of ordinary people in markets and taverns. Thus, the coins themselves in a person's hand reflected their social status, embedding inequality into the very medium of exchange. And yet, coins were unifiers. The same image of the emperor, the same symbolic motifs, were held in the hands of both senators in Rome and farmers in Gaul. In a world of diverse languages and customs, coins offered a common iconography and a common faith in value. Rome ruled not only by the sword, but by the measured rhythm of the movement of coins through markets, taxes, and wages. This leaves us with a question. Could Rome have held its empire without this system of coins? Roads, legions, laws all were critically important, but coins made them function. They allowed for the payment of soldiers, the collection of taxes, the flourishing of trade, and the delivery of propaganda even to the illiterate. Roman coinage was an empire in miniature, each coin a fragment of sovereignty. When we hold a Roman coin today, worn smooth by countless hands, we hold more than metal. We hold a whisper of how an empire once ruled the world with the loose change in its pocket. Why did China invent money twice? At first glance, the question may seem strange, but the history of China gives us cause to pause and reflect. Long before the appearance of coins in the Mediterranean or the spread of silver and gold as symbols of wealth, communities in ancient China experimented with shells, cast strange metal tokens in the shape of spades and knives, and, eventually, created the world's first paper banknotes. The history of Chinese money is not so much a story of a single invention, as it is a long tradition of innovation and reimagining, closely tied to state power and the problem of trust. The first Chinese currency was not metal, but a shell. Archaeologists working at Neolithic sites dating to roughly the 2nd millennium BCE often find fragments of cowrie shells, sometimes in vast quantities, sometimes neatly arranged in burials. Real cowries, which had to be imported from distant southern seas, were highly valued in northern China, where they did not occur naturally. Their rarity, beauty, and durability made them excellent candidates for symbols of value. Some of the oldest Chinese characters in oracle bone script even include a stylized form of the cowrie shell to denote wealth or exchange. It is no coincidence that the written language itself preserved the memory of shells as money. Over time, real shells gave way to imitations. By the end of the 2nd millennium BCE, during the Shang dynasty, craftsmen carved tokens in the shape of shells from bone, stone, and, eventually, bronze. These imitation cowries testify to the transition from a natural currency to an industrial one, a transition that reveals both the growing demand for standardized mediums of exchange and the ability of centralized authorities to regulate them. Bronze cowries, cast in molds and distributed in large quantities, could not be confused with natural shells. They carried the symbolic weight of the old practice, but added a level of control that was beneficial to rulers who wished to stabilize trade and tribute collection. By the 1st millennium BCE, as Chinese society became more complex and states began to compete for dominance during the spring and autumn period and later the warring states period, money itself diversified. This era saw the appearance of the famous knife coins and spade coins. These were not the round-shaped coins we usually imagine, but flat bronze tokens cast in the shape of miniature tools. Some resembled spades or hoes with short handles and flared blades. Others looked like knives, complete with stylized handles and blades, sometimes with characters indicating the issuing authority or city. Why tools specifically? Theories vary. Some scholars believe that these shapes recalled actual utilitarian items that were once swapped in barter, such as agricultural equipment or weapons. By reducing them to bronze miniatures, communities symbolized value, creating portable substitutes. Others argue that these shapes carried a symbolic resonance, linking wealth to labor, land, or military power. In any case, these unusual shapes show that money in ancient China was not yet a universal abstraction, but a deeply cultural artifact reflecting the connections people drew between value and material life. Standardization happened gradually. Different regions minted their own types of spade or knife coins, varying in size, weight, and inscriptions. The Zhou dynasty, especially in its final centuries of rule, saw increasing attempts to unify these currencies. True standardization came only with the rise of the Qin Empire at the end of the 3rd century BCE, when Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, unified China in 221 BCE. He standardized weights, measures, writing, and currency. He abolished the diverse forms of spades and knives and introduced round bronze coins, with a square hole in the center, known as banliang. These round coins, which were easy to string together on a cord through the central hole, became an enduring feature of Chinese money for centuries. The design was simple and effective. The circle symbolized heaven, the square symbolized earth, embodying cosmological harmony in the very form of the coin. Strings of coins could be counted by the hundreds, tied together, and carried across the empire. Trust came not only from state power, but from the predictability of form and weight. Subsequent dynasties refined this system, changing the weight and inscriptions but largely maintaining the circle with a square hole format. Inscriptions were minted on the coins indicating the era of their casting, or the authority of the emperor, which strengthened the close link between money and political legitimacy. However, problems of scale and trust did not disappear. The empire was vast, its economy colossal, and the bronze coin, while durable, was heavy and cumbersome for large transactions. This pressure set the stage for one of China's most remarkable contributions to world history: paper money. The origins of Chinese paper currency are a matter of debate, but the beginnings appear in the Tang Dynasty era, circa 7th centuries, when merchants began to use bills of exchange and promissory notes to avoid carrying heavy coins along dangerous trade routes. These private notes, known as flying money, could be cashed in distant markets and acted as early credit instruments. By the Song Dynasty era, beginning in the 10th centuries, the state intervened. The Song government, faced with economic growth and military needs, began to issue official paper banknotes known as jiaozi. These banknotes were backed by the state and circulated widely. Unlike the previous private instruments, they carried the authority of the dynasty itself. Paper money provided much greater flexibility, allowing the state to quickly mobilize resources and merchants to trade more effectively over long distances. But paper money also carried risks. Unlike coins made of bronze, silver, or gold, paper had no intrinsic value. Its value depended entirely on trust in the issuing authority. As long as the Song government carefully controlled the supply, trust was maintained. But when political pressure mounted, overprinting led to inflation. Later dynasties, including the Yuan under Mongol rule, adopted paper currency, sometimes too enthusiastically, which led to serious economic instability when trust collapsed. The invention of paper money was revolutionary, not only for China but for the entire world. It demonstrated for the first time that value could be completely detached from metal and material scarcity, relying instead on shared belief and political authority. In many ways, this was the second invention of money in China, a leap from physical tokens, such as shells and bronze coins, to abstract representations of value printed on paper. It was an act of faith that transformed trade and governance. Archaeological finds, inscriptions, and surviving fragments of banknotes remind us of the fragility and genius of this system. Early paper money featured complex designs, official seals, and warnings against counterfeiting. Some even contained threats of severe punishment for those who dared to forge them. These measures underscore both the innovativeness and the anxiety surrounding paper money. It was a bold experiment that depended on a delicate balance of power, scarcity, and trust. Looking back, China's trajectory of money development raises questions that we still face today. How much of value lies in material substance, and how much in collective belief? Why do some mediums of exchange flourish, while others fail? And perhaps most hauntingly, was China's early leap to paper money a harbinger of our own modern financial systems, built not so much on gold and silver as on trust and promises? China invented money not once, but twice. The first time was when shells and bronze tokens became standardized tools of exchange, under the rule of powerful states. And the second time was when light and fragile paper was declared by emperors to be the equivalent of the weight of armies and markets. It is a story of creation, ambition, and risk, reminding us that money has always been something more than metal. It is memory, trust, and imagination, cast into forms that we agree to carry in our hands. How did a piece of wood come to be worth more than silver? At first, it seems almost ridiculous to imagine entire economies relying on notchsticks. Nevertheless, for much of medieval Europe, especially from the 9th to the 15th centuries, that is exactly what happened. Wooden tally sticks, with carefully made notches to record obligations, circulated not as trinkets, but as binding contracts. They were not merely reminders, but objects of trust that stood in for wealth, taxes, and even state revenues. To understand their significance is to see that money has always been less about the substance in one's hand and more about the memory it represents. The practice of accounting for debts by making notches on wood predated medieval Europe. Anthropologists point to similar devices used throughout the world to track obligations, livestock, or trade exchanges. But in the early Middle Ages in Europe, after the collapse of Roman administrative structures, tally sticks became central. Coins still existed, but they were often in short supply, subject to debasement, or limited to specific regions. In rural economies, where people were bound by barter and obligation, the tally stick became a powerful substitute for money. The system worked simply, but ingeniously. A piece of hazel or willow was split down the middle. Notches were cut into the surface, each representing a specific amount. Then the stick was broken lengthwise, creating two halves. One half, called the stock the root, hence the modern stock in finance, usually remained with the creditor, while the other, called the foil leaf, remained with the debtor. The splitting ensured that neither half could be altered without obvious damage. Only when joined together did the notches match perfectly, proving the authenticity of the obligation. In a sense, It was a medieval form of cryptography, simple, yet almost impossible to forge without detection. By the 9th century, tally sticks were already firmly established in feudal accounting. Lords used them to record rents from peasants, monasteries to track the obligations of tenants, and merchants to mark advances and credits. What mattered was not that the stick had intrinsic value, but that it carried a memory, sealed in wood and binding both parties with a shared record of debt. Even in communities where coins circulated, tallies flourished because they could preserve memory over long periods of time, being far more flexible than a handful of silver. The English crown transformed the tally stick into a tool of state finance by the 12th century. During the reign of Henry I, early 12th century, their use for tax collection was institutionalized. Sheriffs and officials received tally sticks as evidence of payments due to the treasury. Instead of transporting coins to London, local authorities could deliver a wooden stick with carved notches. The treasury, upon receiving the matching half, accepted it as legal proof of revenue paid. Thus, wood became as authoritative as silver, for it embodied the record in the memory of the kingdom. This system gave rise to a peculiar form of circulation. Tally sticks could change hands, being bought and sold like commodities. If a landowner owed taxes to the crown but had no coins, he could pass a tally stick as payment to another person, who could then pass it further down the chain. Effectively, tally sticks circulated as a form of proto-money. They were promises carved in wood, each carrying the authority of the royal treasury. This practice became so widespread that by the 13th century, some tally sticks were more trusted than coins, as they were harder to clip, forge, or debase. It is important to pause and realize the strangeness of the situation. A tally stick is just wood. Its power derived solely from social agreements and institutional trust. This is why historians, such as the anthropologist Greber, have described tally sticks as examples of money as memory. Unlike metal coins, which claimed value due to rarity, tallies worked because they carried a shared recollection of an obligation, backed by the community and the state. The role of tallies extended beyond taxation. Markets used them to record purchases and sales in the absence of coins. Farmers could pay with a tally that could be cashed in later, after the harvest. Soldiers could be issued tallies as wages, to receive money when the crown collected enough silver. Monasteries used them to account for alms, rents, and gifts. In all these cases, the stick was not a symbol of wealth in itself, but a portable ledger. In essence, it was bookkeeping made flesh. The longevity of this system should not be underestimated. From the 9th to the 15th centuries, tally sticks remained in active use. Coins appeared and disappeared, silver supplies fluctuated, but tallies endured. Even as trade expanded and cities grew in the late Middle Ages, tally sticks maintained their authority. Their strength lay in their adaptability. A tally could represent both a small rent payment and a massive tax obligation, and its authenticity was obvious to anyone holding the second half of the pair. The symbolism of breaking the stick also mattered. It represented the mutual acknowledgement of an obligation, a ritual of shared recognition. The separated halves reminded the creditor and the debtor that their fates were linked. When the debt was repaid, the halves were reunited, destroying the memory inscribed in the wood. Until then, the tally was a living fragment of an obligation, both proof and promise. Feudal Europe thrived on layers of obligations, and tallies fit perfectly into this world. The peasant's duties to the lord, the knight's obligations to the suzerain, the merchant's credit to a partner, all of this could be inscribed in wood. Thus, tally sticks show how economies can function without heavy reliance on coinage. They remind us that wealth is not always metal stored in chests, but trust distributed through relationships. Over time, tallies accumulated not only in estates and markets, but in the very heart of royal treasuries. The English treasury kept them in vast quantities, recording taxes and debts to the crown. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the archives were overflowing with thousands of sticks. Each of them represented a piece of the kingdom's financial history. A forest turned into an empire of memory. The reliance on tally sticks also sheds light on the fragility of medieval money. Coins could be debased by unscrupulous rulers, but tallies, while harder to forge, depended on institutional continuity. If the crown refused to recognize them, their value collapsed. This shaky balance is part of the reason why historians emphasize that money is always a social technology, not just a substance. The value of the tally lay in the persisting authority of the treasury, just as today's banknotes or digital records rely on trust in the issuing institutions. Interestingly, it was the very simplicity of tally sticks that made them so durable. Unlike parchment records, they could not be easily altered. Unlike coins, they did not invite the temptation to clip the edges or melt them down. And unlike oral promises, they lasted longer than the lives or memories of individuals. They were simultaneously humble pieces of wood and the vital arteries of the medieval economy. Nevertheless, we should resist the temptation to see them as merely quaint relics. For 6 centuries, they served as the foundation for serious systems of finance, taxation, and trade. Because of them, entire armies were supplied, cathedrals were built, fields were rented, and debts were settled. To dismiss them as something primitive would be to miss a deeper truth. They show just how much the nature of money lies not in precious material, but in collective memory. When we ask how a piece of wood could be worth more than silver, the answer is haunting because memory itself can become money. An accounting tally, simple as it was, became a vessel of obligation strong enough to carry empires. And if wood could serve as money for centuries, what does that say about the very nature of value? Perhaps the haunting question is not how wood once became wealth, but how many of our own symbols of value are also just sticks waiting for the fire. Why did empires constantly return to shiny metal? Across the world between the 16th and 19th centuries, rulers, merchants, and bankers tried again and again to anchor the foundations of wealth to gold and silver. They could not resist it, despite knowing that money had long since become something more complex than a glinting coin. For them, precious metals promised stability, something tangible in an era of expanding trade, imperial wars, and multiplying paper records. They believed that, if value were anchored to metal, the storms of politics, speculation, and inflation could be contained. Whether they were right is another question. But this obsession itself shaped the birth of the modern global economy. The history begins in the 16th century, when Europe's thirst for noble metals became insatiable. The so-called discovery of the Americas brought not just lands, but rivers of silver and gold. Spanish ships transported vast quantities of bullion across the Atlantic, most often from the Potos mines in what is now Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico. Cerro Rico in Potos, the rich mountain, yielded so much silver that it became a symbol of European dominance and the exploitation of the indigenous population. Enslaved and coerced laborers extracted it in tunnels at an incredible human cost, while mule caravans carried it to refineries, where mercury amalgamation transformed stone into treasure. From there, bullion and coins flowed into the treasury of the Spanish crown. But the silver rarely stayed in Spain for long. Most of it moved across Europe to pay for wars, debts, and imports. Even more significantly, vast volumes of the precious metal left Europe altogether, heading for Asia. China's demand for silver was extraordinary, especially under the Ming dynasty, which adopted silver as the primary medium for taxation and exchange. Effectively, the money supply of the entire planet became linked through silver. A farmer in Potos, a merchant in Seville, a banker in Genoa, and a tax collector in Beijing were bound by this single metallic chain. This was, perhaps, the first truly global monetary system, built not just on paper agreements or promises, but on the actual transport of bullion across oceans. It is tempting to think that gold and silver are the natural choice for this role. They are relatively rare, durable, and divisible. But the real reason empires clung to them was psychological and political. Rulers feared the fragility of credit. Paper banknotes, bills of exchange, or simple promises could evaporate along with a bankrupt merchant or a lost battle. Metal, by contrast, seemed eternal. A gold coin from the 16th century could still buy something in the 17th, while a written contract might mean nothing as soon as the data vanished. The metal itself provided solace in an unstable world. Nevertheless, a grim irony lay hidden here. Precious metals could not guarantee stability, because their supply was tied to mines and conquests. When silver flooded in from Potos, prices across Europe rose in what economists later called the price revolution. Inflation spread as more coins chased the same quantity of goods. Instead of providing stability, the sudden flood of silver destabilized entire economies. Spain, literally bathing in bullion, paradoxically plunged into a series of bankruptcies. Its wealth leaked into the hands of financiers and creditors abroad. Faith in the immutability of metal proved to be more symbolic than practical. However, even as evidence of instability grew, the attachment to metal only strengthened. In the 17th century, other empires joined the hunt. The Dutch built their commercial dominance on the careful management of silver and gold flows, using Amsterdam as a clearinghouse where metal could be exchanged and regulated. The English, becoming a rising power, also relied on bullion as the anchor of their growing financial system. In both cases, the physical presence of metal in vaults reassured merchants. Their receipts and bills were backed by something tangible. By the 18th century, gold began to displace silver as the preferred anchor in much of Europe. Silver was abundant, but its supply was becoming increasingly volatile. Gold, rarer and symbolically more weighty, seemed a more reliable standard. Britain, for example, gradually moved toward a gold-based system during the 18th and early 19th centuries, even before the official legislative adoption of the gold standard. In this environment, the idea formed that a country's money must be exchangeable for a fixed amount of precious metal. Colonialism reinforced this model. As European powers expanded their influence in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, they sought to control mines and metal flows. The Portuguese in Brazil developed massive gold deposits, feeding European markets and enriching Lisbon. The French, the British, and others sought the same. The logic was simple. Power required money, money required stability, and stability required metal. Armies were paid in coin, navies were supplied by bullion, and treaties were backed by shipments of gold and silver. China remained a central figure throughout this history. Its demand for silver in the 16th and 17th centuries pulled Europe into the first global economy of precious metals. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, this dependency became a weakness. When British merchants began exporting opium to China to correct the trade imbalance, it led to a reversal of silver flows. The outflow of metal destabilized the king economy and provoked conflicts that reshaped the 19th century. Once again, the belief that silver embodied stability clashed with reality. Its flow could undermine entire states. The irony of these centuries is that the more strongly empires tried to anchor themselves to precious metals, the more they discovered the fragility of that anchor. Wars, trade imbalances, and new discoveries could change the supply overnight. Yet rulers and economists continued to return to the same solution: fix value in metal, and all will be well. They believed the luster of bullion was a shield against chaos. It is easy to understand this temptation. A pile of gold coins on a table feels eternal, beyond the reach of politics or memory. But history tells a different story. The gold and silver of the early modern empires were not just inert treasures. They were extracted from mines by human labor, transported across oceans by fragile ships, and melted into coins stamped with royal faces. Their value lay in the violence and the institutions behind them, just as much as in the shimmering surface of the metal. By the early 19th century, the idea of the gold standard was no longer just a practice, but an ideology. Economists and politicians spoke of it as the natural way to stabilize currency. Yet it took centuries of turbulent experimentation, inflation, crashes, and conquests to arrive at this. The shiny metal that seemed so reliable brought both prosperity and ruin. So why did empires continue to return to it? Perhaps because metal offered a kind of illusion, a tangible anchor in a world where promises were often broken. Gold and silver looked eternal, even as their supplies rose and fell. They shone in vaults and crowns, convincing rulers and subjects alike that wealth could be held in the palm of the hand. The haunting question is whether this illusion was ever a reality. If centuries of precious metal economics ended in instability, then perhaps gold and silver were never truly a solid foundation, but merely shimmering mirrors of human trust. And if that is the case, what does it mean for how we fix value today? Why does paper have value only because the state says so? For much of human history, value was imagined as something based on metal, on weight, on the tangibility of gold and silver. However, starting in the 17th century, and with increasing speed thereafter, states, merchants, and ordinary people began to live with a different type of money or currency that had no intrinsic value other than the promise that others would accept it. This is what we call fiat decree money. The word comes from the Latin fiat, meaning let it be done. In other words, money by decree. It is an extraordinary leap of imagination and, perhaps, of faith to treat a scrap of paper or today, a series of digits, as wealth in itself. The question is not so much why this system rose, but how human societies learned to trust it and why it still works today. The origins can be traced to early experiments with paper money in China under the Song dynasty, starting in the 11th century. These were not yet fully fiat, as they were often tied to reserves or exchangeable for coins. But the precedent was set. The state could issue notes backed by its authority, rather than a specific ingot of metal. In Europe, this shift occurred later. In the 17th century, states and merchants faced practical limitations. Wars were expensive, trade was expanding, and transporting bullion was slow, dangerous, and insufficient. Banks in cities like Amsterdam and Stockholm began issuing notes that could circulate more easily than bags of coins. In England in 1694, the Bank of England was founded to finance war, and its notes soon began to circulate as a form of currency. Initially, these notes were promises to pay in metal, but over time, people began to use them as if they were money itself. The real turning point came when governments realized they could completely sever the link between banknotes and precious metals. This did not happen all at once, but through crises. In the 18th and 19th centuries, wars drained treasuries, forcing the suspension of exchange for metal. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain suspended the convertibility of its notes into gold. People continued to use the notes not because they could be exchanged, but because they trusted the government and because there was no alternative. Each suspension and return to convertibility exposed the fragility of the system, but also its resilience, the authority of the state alone, and the willingness of people to believe its word, was enough to make money function even without metal behind it. By the 20th century, fiat money had become the global norm. The Great Depression, World Wars, and finally the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in the early 1970s played their part. When the United States, under President Nixon in 1971, officially abandoned the gold standard, it marked the decisive end of any link between major currencies and precious metal. From that moment on, the value of money was based entirely on trust in governments, central banks, and the economy as a whole. What was once considered a dangerous experiment became everyday reality. The advantages of fiat money are obvious in retrospect. It is flexible. The government can expand or contract the supply depending on economic conditions. This allows for responses to crises, investment in infrastructure, and the financing of wars without the strict constraints of metallic reserves. It is portable and scalable, functioning in vast economies where no real supply of gold could ever keep pace with demand. Fiat money also encourages financial innovation, making possible complex credit systems, bonds, and international markets that would be unthinkable if every transaction required weighing metal. But the system carries risks, and these risks explain why many resisted it for so long. Without a metallic anchor, fiat money depends entirely on trust. If people lose faith in the government's promises, paper banknotes can devalue to zero. History is full of such examples. In 18th century France, the assignats issued during the Revolution spiraled into hyperinflation and were eventually abandoned. In the early 20th century, the Weimar Republic in Germany saw the collapse of its currency as paper money lost value by the hour. Zimbabwe, in the early 21st century, issued banknotes with absurd denominations as trust evaporated. Each case showed that fiat money is only as strong as the institutions and social contracts that support it. Nevertheless, such collapses are the exception rather than the rule. Most of the time, fiat systems hold up because people collectively agree they should. The banknote says it is legal tender, and by virtue of law and habit, it circulates. This reliance on trust may seem fragile, but in practice, it can be more stable than a metal-based system, which is vulnerable to sudden deposit discoveries, mine output volumes, or political control over bullion. A gold coin can be clipped, debased, or hidden. A paper banknote, by contrast, is infinitely reproducible by the state, and its value can be regulated by policy rather than geology. This is a profound philosophical leap. For millennia, humans tied money to objects. Shells, livestock, silver, gold. Fiat money untethered value from substance and rooted it in collective belief. It is an act of imagination as much as an act of economics. Some anthropologists argue that this returns money to its origins, to memory and trust. In the Paleolithic and Neolithic periods, debts and gifts were recorded in mines and customs, not in metal. Fiat money is, in a way, a return to this principle, but now managed on the scale of states and central banks rather than small communities. Living under a fiat system means accepting a constant gamble. We accept paper and numbers in exchange for labor, because we believe others will do the same tomorrow. In stable times, this confidence is rarely questioned, but it is never absolute. Every economic downturn, every political crisis, every spike in inflation awakens doubts. And yet, despite centuries of skepticism, fiat systems have proven remarkably durable. They laid the foundation for industrial revolutions, world wars, and the growth of global trade. One might ask, does the reliance on trust make fiat money more human than its metallic predecessors? Gold and silver were objects of geology, indifferent to our choices. Fiat money is a purely human construct, depending on institutions, language, and law. In this sense, it embodies our collective capacity to create systems literally out of nothing but consent. This is simultaneously empowering and unsettling. So why does paper have value? Only because the state says so. Because enough of us choose to believe it. And because the mechanisms of law and enforcement ensure that this belief continues. It works until it stops working. The haunting question is not whether fiat money is real. It certainly is. The question is how long our trust will last. If all money is memory and promise, then fiat money is the clearest mirror of ourselves. This reflects our willingness to trust one another and the states that bind us, even when the paper in our hands is nothing more than ink and fiber. If 96% of money is digital, does it exist at all? When most of us imagine money, we still envision something physical. The jingle of coins in a jar, paper bills in a wallet, a stack of banknotes passed across a counter. However, in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, most money ceased to exist in physical form. It became code, a sequence of digits glowing on a screen, moving through networks, summoned by a wave of a hand or a touch. This transition is now so familiar that it hardly seems remarkable. But on a historical scale, it represents one of the most radical transformations of money in thousands of years. For the first time, money is no longer tied to any object at all. It is entries in databases, pulses of electricity, and agreements stored on servers. This raises a troubling question. If most money today is intangible, what exactly are we trusting? The transition did not happen instantly. It grew out of 20th century infrastructure. Credit cards were among the first steps. The Diners Club card appeared in 1950. It was followed by bank-issued cards like Visa and MasterCard, which spread rapidly in the 1960s and 70s. Initially, these cards were not yet fully digital. They relied on paper receipts and carbon copies. But behind the scenes, banks were already building systems that would soon turn payments into streams of electronic information. By the 1980s, electronic fund transfers and ATMs had become routine. Money was turning into data long before most people noticed. The spread of the internet in the 1990s accelerated this shift. Online banking, digital transfers, and e-commerce turned the screen itself into a place of exchange. Suddenly, it was possible to transfer value without touching cash, without holding a check, and without even entering a bank. The act of payment became abstract. For younger generations, clicking a button on a website or tapping a card against a terminal has become the norm. By the early 21st century, in many countries, physical cash accounted for less than 5% of the money supply. The rest existed only as balances recorded in bank computers. This immateriality can be disorienting. When money is paper or a coin, it has weight, texture, and presence. When it is code, it is invisible. Nonetheless, the same principle applies. It works because people trust the system. Your bank account balance is not a stack of bills in a vault with your name on it. It is an entry in a ledger. When you buy groceries with a debit card, no cash moves. Several databases adjust their numbers, and the store accepts this adjustment as real payment. The system relies on networks, encryption, and the authority of institutions to guarantee the reliability of these intangible flows. Digital wallets and mobile payments have pushed abstraction even further. Companies like PayPal, Alipay, and later Apple Pay and Google Pay turned phones into instruments of exchange. In many cities, entire generations almost never carry physical cash. A smartphone and a bank account are enough to participate in the economy. This convenience comes at the cost of dependency. To use digital money, you need access to electricity, servers, and networks. Without them, the illusion of instantaneous value transfer collapses. In this sense, the system is more fragile than any physical currency of the past. Cryptocurrency has taken the transformation into even stranger territory. Beginning with Bitcoin in 2009, developers attempted to create money without states or banks, relying on decentralized code and consensus rather than institutional trust. Whatever one thinks of its long-term prospects, cryptocurrency showed how far the abstraction of money could go. A currency emerged that has no physical existence, no issuing authority, and no intrinsic value, yet can be traded and held as wealth. Critics call it speculation disguised as money. Supporters call it liberation from centralized control. Either way, it highlights the degree to which money has become an act of imagination sustained by code. Some economists argue that this digital turn simply reveals what money has always been: an agreement, not a thing. From shells and coins to paper and banknotes, money worked because people treated it as such. The difference today lies in scale and speed. Digital systems allow trillions of dollars to move across the globe in seconds. They allow for microtransactions smaller than any coin ever minted. The economy has turned into a web of signals, where money flows like light through cables. Still, haunting questions remain. What happens when the system fails? Power outages, cyber attacks, and systemic glitches can freeze the flow of value. When so much wealth is data, vulnerabilities multiply. Another question is psychological. Does money feel less real when you never touch it? Studies show that people spend more freely when paying by card or phone than when handing over cash. Perhaps because the pain of parting with tangible money is gone. Digital money changes not just economics, but behavior. So, does money exist if 96% of it is digital? The answer depends on what we mean by existence. You cannot hold it in your hands, but you can exchange it for food, shelter, or travel. It shapes our lives as powerfully as any coin. Its reality lies not in metal or paper, but in code, trust, and networks. We live in an era where money is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. a mirage that we have all agreed to chase. Perhaps the deeper question is whether we control this mirage, or whether the mirage now controls us. Was money humanity's greatest invention or our first mistake? This question hangs uncomfortably on the edge of history, because we cannot say where the invention ends and the mistake begins. We only know that somewhere on the shores of the Black Sea in the 5th millennium BCE, people placed gold in graves, giving it a meaning that went beyond mere decoration. They measured and weighed. They assigned value and left us the first indisputable evidence of property inequality. That shining treasure in Varna is not just the oldest gold. It is one of the first mirrors of ourselves, reflecting the possibility that humans began to organize their world not only by kinship or rituals, but by material divisions. The invention of money was not a moment, but a long drift of practices that turned into systems. Before coins, before silver ingots or measures of grain, there were debts, shells, and livestock as living wealth. However, the burials in Varna remind us that wealth is not just about exchange. It is about distinction. Some have, and some do not. Those graves show that money or proto-money always carried the weight of hierarchy. It was never neutral. From there, the trail stretches through the millennia. In Mesopotamia, they counted silver. In Egypt, gold shone as divine. In Lydia, metal was stamped into coins. In Greece, soldiers were paid for their loyalty. In Rome, the faces of emperors became the face of money itself. Each step reinforced the idea that value could be standardized, abstracted, and controlled. But a shadow grew alongside it. Standardized value could be manipulated. Debasement of coinage, taxes. The accumulation and concentration of wealth are as old as the systems themselves. Money was the language of power, spoken in metal, shells, paper, and later code. And yet, money was always more fragile than it seemed. A coin could be clipped, a tally stick broken, a digital record erased. At the core lies the same brittle foundation. Trust. Trust that the shell will be accepted, that the ingot has weight, that the piece of paper is backed by something. This is the paradox. Money feels solid, but it is one of the most intangible inventions, sustained only by shared imagination. Nevertheless, imagination is powerful. It built cities, mobilized armies, and bound strangers into trade networks. Money allowed a farmer in Anatolia to feed a soldier in Athens, and a merchant in China to exchange goods for furs from the steppe. It connected worlds through tokens that replaced personal trust. But if money is a bridge, it is also a wall. The Varna burials are merely the first example of how wealth marks differences. The emergence of elites, classes, and the division between rich and poor are stories repeated for 6,000 years. Each new form of money carried the potential to unite through exchange, and divide through accumulation. We may admire the beauty of gold jewelry or the genius of paper systems, but we cannot ignore that every innovation was accompanied by costs measured in the lives of people. At the bottom of the pyramid, looking back at this long path, one wonders, was inequality inevitable from the moment of money's birth? Did the first exchange shell contain the seed of classism? Did the first silver ingot imply debt? Archaeology provides no direct answers, but the pattern suggests money was never just a convenience. It was a tool of organization, and like any such tool, it could include or exclude. We still carry this legacy. We do not bury gold diadems in graves, but we bury status in residential neighborhoods, education, and access to resources. The chilling detail is that inequality is not an accidental byproduct of money. It is one of its earliest characteristics. From the 5th millennium to the present day, money indicates to us who and where one stands in the world order. Does this mean money was a mistake? Perhaps it is better to say that money was a mirror. It reflected the human capacity for abstraction, trust, and cooperation, but also for dominance, greed, and exclusion. We cannot separate these things. Without money, great civilizations might not have arisen, art and science might not have flourished so luxuriantly. But without it, we might have avoided the deep rifts that divide us today. When we look at the treasures of Varna or the silver shekels of Mesopotamia, what do we actually see? Not just valuable objects, but fossils of trust and inequality. Was it the greatest gift or the first mistake? It seems to be both. The real question is whether we continue to invent money, or whether money has long since been inventing us. If we wind back time, we see not a straight line, but a shifting mosaic. The first signs of value exchange are not at all what we call money. For tens of thousands of years before temples and markets, groups of hunter-gatherers moved stones, shells, and beads over astonishing distances. A shell drilled to be worn on a string was proof that someone else, far away, was important enough for exchange. Before money was recorded, it was kept in memory. In the Neolithic era, when people settled and took up farming, the scale of exchange expanded. Domestic animals became walking stocks of wealth. Cows and sheep reproduced themselves. This living currency bound people to one another, as large animals required collective labor and agreements over pastures. A bride price, a treaty, or a debt could be measured in heads of cattle. Alongside animals, minerals appeared. Salt, for example, was one of the most curious early proto-currencies. Essential for survival and difficult to transport, it shaped entire trade routes. But metals were already transforming human thinking. By the 5th millennium BCE, copper appeared across Southeast Europe. The gold in the Varna necropolis in unprecedented quantities, necklaces, bracelets, diadems suggests that accumulation even then meant something more than just beauty. It was a signal of hierarchy. The seeds of future money were sown not by kings, but by communities that needed to coordinate life on a new level. In the river civilizations of the Near East, the evidence becomes clearer. In the temples of Mesopotamia, silver appeared as a measure of weight, the shekel. This was not money in everyone's pocket, but money as accounting. Clay tablets preserve contracts where silver was the standard of calculation. Money in its first measurable form was never separate from power. Egypt presented a different picture. Gold there had divine associations. For the Egyptians, the imperishability of gold reflected eternity. Its role was not so much in market exchange as in anchoring the order of society. In the 7th-6th centuries BCE, more recognizable money appeared in Lydia. Minted coins of electrum, an alloy of gold and silver. The stamp carried the authority of the state. It was no longer necessary to weigh the metal for every transaction. From there, the practice spread to the Greek world, where minting became intertwined with politics, war, and democracy. In classical Greece, the silver coin provided the power of Athens. Soldiers and sailors received payment in standard silver, which turned military service into a profession. Rome went even further. From the 3rd century BCE, the Roman mint issued coins with the faces of emperors. It was propaganda in bronze and silver. Every coin in a soldier's hand served as a reminder of the power he served. Even when the metal was debased, the images proclaimed stability. In the East, China followed its own path. From cowrie shells to bronze coins in the shape of knives and spades, and finally to round coins with a square hole. And then, centuries before the rest of the world, the Chinese began an experiment with paper money during the Song dynasty. Again, trust and state power merged into one. From this long prehistory, it follows that there was no single invention of money, but many threads: livestock and salt, shells and copper, silver and gold. Each form answered the question: how to measure and transfer value between people who cannot rely solely on personal acquaintance. The haunting question remains: does this deep past reveal more about human genius or human inequality? The first gold of Varna, the first silver of Mesopotamia. These are milestones of abstraction and imagination, but also milestones of division. To own more metal meant to own more power. We cannot decide whether money was our best invention or our first mistake, but we can say that from the Paleolithic to the empires of Rome and Han, money bound people together and divided them. It carried trust and hierarchy. The history of money is not a modern financial report, but a story of deep time, in which humans learned to make value visible, portable, and divisible. This story is not yet finished, but its first chapters still lie in the earth, waiting for us to read them with reverence and wonder. Thank you, dear Sapiens, for walking along this timeline with me, for diving into deep time, and for slowing down to remember. If this helped you sleep, helped with your studies, or simply allowed you to step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. Stay curious, stay calm. See you in the next story.